Before any law could be carved into stone, the very concept of a society that required such laws had to be born from the soil itself. This genesis occurred in a vast arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf, through the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and curving towards the Mediterranean coast. This region, the Fertile Crescent, provided the unique environmental conditions necessary for the most profound transformation in human history. For millennia, humanity had existed in small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers, their lives dictated by the seasonal migration of animals and the availability of wild plants. This precarious existence began to change as the end of the last ice age brought a warmer, wetter climate to the Near East. This climatic shift fostered the growth of dense stands of wild grasses, particularly einkorn wheat, emmer wheat, and barley, the genetic ancestors of modern cereals. The abundance of these resources allowed certain groups to become more sedentary, establishing seasonal camps that gradually evolved into permanent settlements. This shift was accelerated by the domestication of key animal species. The wild goats and sheep of the Zagros Mountains were among the first to be tamed, followed by cattle and pigs. This Neolithic revolution was not an event, but a slow process, a gradual accumulation of knowledge that allowed humans to control their food supply for the first time. The ability to produce a surplus of food was the catalyst for civilization. To manage the unpredictable and often violent floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, early farmers developed sophisticated irrigation systems, digging canals to divert water to their fields and constructing dikes to protect their settlements. The invention of the plough, initially a simple ard pulled by oxen, allowed for the cultivation of much larger areas of land than was possible with hand tools, dramatically increasing crop yields. With this agricultural abundance came the need for storage, leading to the development of pottery, whose fired clay vessels could protect surplus grain from moisture and pests. This surplus fundamentally reordered human society. When not everyone was required to participate in food production, new roles could emerge. Artisans began to specialize in pottery, weaving, and metallurgy. Priests emerged to manage the increasingly complex rituals needed to appease the gods who were believed to control the harvest and the floods. A warrior class developed to protect the stored wealth of the community from raids by nomadic groups. This labor specialization led directly to social stratification. Society was no longer egalitarian. It was now organized into a hierarchy, with a ruling elite of priests and warriors overseeing a larger population of farmers and craftsmen. During the Ubaid period, from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, these developments coalesced in southern Mesopotamia. Settlements like Eridu grew from small villages into the world's first towns, organized around large, elaborate temple structures. These temples were not merely places of worship, they were the economic and administrative hearts of the community, controlling vast tracts of agricultural land, storing communal grain reserves, and organizing the labor required for large-scale irrigation projects. Just a quick announcement. If you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. As these communities grew in size and complexity, so too did the potential for conflict. Disputes over land ownership, water rights, inheritance, and commercial transactions became increasingly common. The simple customs that had governed small kin-based groups were no longer sufficient to maintain order in a society of thousands. It was from this growing complexity, this intricate web of new social and economic relationships, that the need for a formal written system of justice first arose, creating the foundational demand for a comprehensive code of laws. The societal structures born in the Ubaid period were merely a prelude to the explosive urban growth that would define the subsequent Uruk period, from approximately 4,000 to 3,100 BCE. The large towns of southern Mesopotamia did not simply grow larger, they transformed into something entirely new, the city-state. Uruk stands as the archetype of this transformation, expanding to cover an estimated 250 hectares and housing a population that may have reached 50,000 people, a density of human life unprecedented in history. This urban revolution was fueled by a series of critical innovations. Chief among them was the invention of writing. Around 3200 BCE, temple administrators in Uruk developed cuneiform, a script of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay. Its purpose was not literary, but economic, to track the vast quantities of grain, livestock, and goods flowing into and out of the temple complexes. This administrative tool was revolutionary, allowing for a level of economic planning and control that was previously impossible. Alongside writing came the cylinder seal, a small engraved stone cylinder that could be rolled across clay to create a unique, repeating impression, serving as a form of signature to verify ownership and authorize transactions. The political organization of these new entities also evolved. While the temple remained a central institution, a secular authority figure, the Lugal or big man, emerged from the warrior class. The Lugal's power was based on military leadership, and his palace began to compete with the temple as a center of political and economic power. Each city-state, such as Kish, Lagash, and Eridu, was a sovereign entity, a self-contained world controlling its surrounding agricultural hinterland, which could stretch for dozens of kilometers. This patchwork of independent, powerful, and proximate states created an environment where conflict was not just possible but inevitable. The very resources that had allowed these cities to flourish became the primary sources of contention. The lifeblood of Sumerian civilization was the water of the Tigris and Euphrates, managed through a complex network of canals. A city-state located upstream could, by building a new dam or diverting a major canal, effectively starve a downstream rival, making control over water rights a matter of existential importance. Just as vital was the control of arable land. As populations grew, the fertile fields between cities became fiercely contested border zones. The conflict between the city-states of Lagash and Umma over the Guedin Plain is the most well-documented of these disputes, a bitter struggle that spanned multiple generations and was recorded on monuments like the Stelae of the Vultures. These were not wars of annihilation, but chronic, low-level conflicts aimed at securing control over vital agricultural resources. Furthermore, southern Mesopotamia lacked many essential raw materials, including stone, metal ores, and quality timber. Access to these resources depended on long-distance trade routes, control of which became another major point of friction between the city-states. A city that could dominate a key river port or overland caravan route gained a significant economic and military advantage over its neighbors. These constant disputes, simmering for centuries, created a state of endemic warfare. This reality, combined with the increasingly complex internal administration of the cities themselves, demonstrated that informal customs and religious edicts were no longer sufficient. The volatile world of competing city-states demanded a more rigid, explicit, and universally applicable framework of justice to regulate both internal society and the fragile relationships with their rivals. The centuries of internecine conflict between Sumerian city-states eventually gave way to a new political reality, the empire. The Akkadian Empire under Sargon had provided a template for unification, but its collapse, followed by a period of chaos under Gutian invaders, left Mesopotamia fractured once more. It was out of this disarray, around 2112 BCE, that a new power arose to restore Sumerian order. Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, was more than a conqueror. He was a consolidator and an administrator. After securing his kingdom through military victory, he faced the immense challenge of governing a diverse territory populated by people with differing local customs. To legitimize his rule and unify his nascent empire, he initiated a series of sweeping reforms, the most significant of which was the creation of the world's first known comprehensive legal code. Unlike the grand diorite stelae of his famous successor, the Code of Ur-Nammu survives today only in fragments. primarily on baked clay tablets discovered by archaeologists at Nippur and other ancient centers. These copies, transcribed by scribal students centuries after the original was promulgated, are all that remain of what was likely a monumental public inscription. The text begins with a prologue, a feature that would become standard for all subsequent Mesopotamian law codes. In it, Ur-Nammu establishes his divine mandate, declaring that the gods An and Enlil had appointed Nana, the moon god of Ur, to rule over the land, and that Nana had, in turn, chosen Ur-Nammu as his earthly representative. This theological framing was a critical act of political propaganda, positioning the king not as a mere warlord, but as the chosen shepherd of the Sumerian people, tasked with establishing divine justice on earth. The laws themselves, of which about 40 are partially preserved, reveal a legal philosophy starkly different from the principle of retaliation that would later define Hammurabi's code. Instead of an eye for an eye, the code of Ur-Nammu was overwhelmingly compensatory. Justice was primarily achieved not through physical punishment, but through monetary fines. If a man severed another's foot, the penalty was not the severing of his own, but a fine of 10 shekels of silver. If he smashed another's tooth, the fine was 2 shekels. This system extended to social crimes as well. A man who deflowered another's virgin slave woman was required to pay 5 shekels. This emphasis on financial restitution suggests a society focused on restoring economic balance and avoiding the blood feuds that could arise from retaliatory violence. However, the code was not without severe punishments. Capital offences such as murder, robbery, and the rape of another man's wife were met with the death penalty. The laws also reflect a conscious effort to protect the most vulnerable members of society from exploitation. The prologue explicitly states that Ur-Nammu would ensure the orphan was not given over to the rich, the widow was not given over to the powerful, the man of 1 shekel was not given over to the man of 1 mina. This was the first recorded instance of a ruler codifying his duty to protect the poor and weak, establishing a powerful ideal of social justice. The Code of Ur-Nammu was a foundational document, a first attempt to create a state-run system of justice based on written, publicly accessible laws. It established the principle that all citizens, regardless of their home city, were subject to the same legal standard, a revolutionary concept that was essential for the cohesion of the new empire. The imperial unity forged by the third dynasty of Ur proved to be a fragile and temporary state. By the turn of the 2nd millennium BCE, internal decay and external pressure from Amorite migrations and Elamite invasions caused the empire to crumble. Mesopotamia reverted to its older political pattern, a mosaic of competing city-states. In this fractured landscape, the city of Isin rose to prominence, claiming to be the legitimate successor to the legacy of Ur. It was in this context of precarious authority that Lipit-Ishtar, the 5th king of the Isin dynasty, promulgated his own legal code around 1930 BCE. Unlike Ur-Nammu's laws, which were designed to unify a vast empire, Lipit-Ishtar's code was an instrument of statecraft in an age of intense competition, a declaration of justice intended to stabilize his own kingdom and project an image of righteous rule to his rivals, chiefly the rising power of Larsa. Written in Sumerian, though Lipit-Ishtar himself was of Amorite descent, the code is known to us through fragmentary copies from scribal schools, pieced together by modern scholars. Like its predecessor, it features a prologue that grounds the king's authority in divine will, stating that the gods An and Enlil had called upon him to establish justice in the land, to eliminate complaints, to turn back enmity and rebellion by force of arms, and to bring well-being to the people of Sumer and Akkad. This was not the proclamation of a secure emperor, but the assertion of a king striving to maintain order in a volatile world. The laws that follow, of which about 50 are partially legible, demonstrate a significant evolution in legal complexity and specificity, addressing the nuanced problems of a more developed and commercially active society. The laws of Lipit Ishtar delve into matters of family and inheritance with a detail unseen in Ur-Nammu's code. They address, for instance, the legal standing of children born to a man by both his primary wife and a slave woman, ensuring the latter's children were granted freedom and a share of the inheritance upon the father's death, provided he had formally recognized them. Another law stipulates the dowry rights of a man's daughter, making it clear that if he had children by a second wife, his daughter from the first marriage still inherited as if she were a direct heir. These provisions reflect a society grappling with complex family structures and the need to ensure social stability through clear inheritance laws. The code also reveals a sophisticated understanding of property and commerce. One set of laws deals specifically with the rental of oxen, outlining the renter's liability for injuries to the animal, with different fines for a torn eye, horn, or tail. Another law addresses the case of a man who gives his orchard to a gardener to cultivate. The gardener is entitled to a share of the produce, but if he neglects his duties, he is still liable for the orchard's expected yield. A particularly notable innovation was the criminalization of false accusation. A person who wrongfully accused another of a crime was required to bear the penalty for that crime himself. While the code largely continues the Sumerian tradition of compensatory fines over physical retaliation, it represents a clear intellectual advancement, a crucial legal bridge between the foundational work of Ur-Nammu and the comprehensive legal monument that Hammurabi would later create. By the dawn of the 18th century BCE, the political geography of Mesopotamia had transformed into a complex and volatile system of powerful competing kingdoms. The era of a single dominant empire, like that of Ur, was a distant memory. The landscape was now defined by a handful of major regional powers, each ruled by kings of Amorite lineage. These dynasties, originating from West Semitic peoples who had migrated into the region over centuries, had fully assimilated into Mesopotamian culture, adopting the Akkadian language for diplomacy and administration and patronizing the ancient Sumerian gods. Yet they brought a new dynamism and a distinct political style to the ancient courts of the Fertile Crescent. This period is often described by historians as an age of internationalism, a great powers club, where a delicate and ever-shifting balance of power was maintained through a sophisticated network of diplomacy, trade, and warfare. In the south, the kingdom of Larsa stood as the preeminent power, its long-reigning king, Rimsin I, having finally conquered his great rival, Izin, to consolidate control over the old heartland of Sumer. To the east, along the Diyala River, the kingdom of Eshnunna was a formidable force, controlling crucial trade routes that brought tin from the Iranian plateau. In the north, a vast but short-lived empire had been forged by the ambitious Shamshi-Adad I, an Amorite king who seized the throne of Ashur and established what is now called the Kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia. His domain was vast, stretching across northern Syria and Iraq, and he controlled the great city of Mari on the middle Euphrates, which he entrusted to his son to govern as viceroy. The archives discovered at Mari, containing over 20,000 cuneiform tablets of diplomatic correspondence, reveal the intricate workings of this era. Kings addressed each other as brother, exchanged lavish gifts, and cemented alliances through strategic marriages of their daughters. Yet beneath this veneer of fraternal diplomacy was a current of constant espionage, betrayal, and military posturing. This was the world into which Hammurabi was born. The Babylon he inherited was a respectable but secondary power, a kingdom of modest size and influence, overshadowed by its powerful neighbors. It was strategically located at the nexus of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the two rivers flow closest, giving it potential control over vital trade and communication lines. But it was also dangerously exposed, caught between the southern might of Larsa and the northern ambitions of Shamshi-Adad. The political survival of a Babylonian king depended on shrewd diplomacy, the ability to place stronger rivals against one another, and the patience to wait for the opportune moment to act. The international system was a web of treaties and mutual defense pacts, but these alliances were fluid and pragmatic, rarely lasting more than a few years. A declaration of war was often preceded by a formal denunciation, a letter from one king to another explaining the casus belli, demonstrating a recognized, if often violated, code of international conduct. This complex tapestry of kingdoms, a world of powerful Amorite warlords ruling ancient Sumerian and Akkadian cities, was the chessboard upon which Hammurabi would begin his reign. In the grand theatre of 18th century Mesopotamian politics, the city of Babylon was, for a long time, only a secondary actor. Its history, while ancient, was not as storied as that of Ur or Nippur. First mentioned in records from the Akkadian Empire, Babylon had remained a provincial town of little consequence for centuries. Its rise to a kingdom of note was a relatively recent development, beginning with the establishment of the first dynasty of Babylon by the Amorite chieftain Sumu-Abum around 1894 BCE. This dynasty methodically expanded its control over the immediate vicinity, transforming Babylon from a city into the capital of a small but coherent territorial state. Yet, even after a century of this dynasty's rule, the kingdom Hammurabi would inherit was modest in every respect. Its territory was compact, its army was unproven against the major powers, and its political influence was limited. The city's primary deity was Marduk, who at this point in history held a relatively minor position in the Mesopotamian pantheon. He was not yet the king of the gods. That honor still belonged to the ancient Sumerian god Enlil, whose cult center at Nippur remained the religious heart of the land. Marduk's main temple in Babylon, the Asagila, was a respectable sanctuary, but lacked the prestige and wealth of the great temples in Larsa or Eshnunna. The city's economic foundation was solid but unremarkable, based on the productive agriculture of its immediate hinterland and its participation in regional trade networks. Its strategic location was its greatest asset and its most profound vulnerability. Situated where the Tigris and Euphrates flow nearest to one another, Babylon could potentially control the arteries of trade and communication between the north and south. However, this position also meant it was hemmed in, a buffer state caught between the ambitions of its more powerful neighbors. Hammurabi's immediate predecessors had pursued a cautious foreign policy focused on survival. His father, Sin-Muballit, had engaged in a series of defensive wars and minor territorial expansions, strengthening the city's fortifications and building up its military capacity, but he never managed to fundamentally alter Babylon's secondary status. He fought inconclusive wars against Larsa and was forced to become a vassal, at least nominally, to the great northern king Shamshi-Adad. The Babylon of this era was a kingdom that had learned to survive through pragmatism and careful diplomacy, not through conquest. Its rulers were adept at forming temporary alliances, paying tribute when necessary, and avoiding direct confrontation with superior forces. This was the inheritance of Hammurabi, not an empire, but a well-organized, strategically located, yet fundamentally vulnerable kingdom, a minor power whose continued existence depended entirely on the skill and foresight of its king. The personal history of Hammurabi's early life, like that of nearly all ancient monarchs, is lost to us. Cuneiform records were concerned with royal deeds and economic transactions, not princely biographies. Yet, the environment and education that shaped a Babylonian heir apparent in the 18th century BCE are well understood from the scribal curriculum and administrative texts of the period. Hammurabi was not simply born, he was meticulously forged into a king by the institutions of the state he was destined to rule. His formative years would have been a rigorous apprenticeship in the arts of governance, a program designed to produce a ruler capable of navigating the treacherous currents of Mesopotamian politics. The foundation of this education was literacy, a rare and powerful skill. From a young age, the prince would have been drilled in the complexities of cuneiform, mastering not only his native Akkadian, but also the classical Sumerian language, which was essential for religious and legal scholarship. His tutors, the elite scribes of the palace, would have guided him through the established curriculum, beginning with the copying of sign lists and lexical texts before moving on to the great literary works. This was an education designed to instill a specific worldview. The prince would have studied the epic tales of legendary kings like Gilgamesh, learning the ideals of heroism, the responsibilities of kingship, and the tragic finality of mortality. He would have memorized royal hymns and king lists, embedding within him the long, divinely sanctioned history of Mesopotamian monarchy. This literary immersion was supplemented by an intense study of mathematics, not as an abstract discipline, but as a practical tool for managing a kingdom. He would have learned to calculate the yields of agricultural land, the manpower needed for canal construction, and the complex interest rates that governed the Babylonian economy. This was the knowledge of a micromanager, a ruler expected to understand every facet of his state's operation. His religious instruction would have been equally pragmatic. While devoted to Babylon's patron deity, Marduk, he would have been taught the intricate theology of the entire pantheon and the critical political importance of respecting the cult of Enlil at Nippur, the traditional source of royal legitimacy in the land. A prince learned that piety was an instrument of statecraft, a means of securing the loyalty of diverse subject cities. Beyond the scribal school, his education would have been political and military. He would have sat in the court of his father, Sin Muballit, observing the reception of ambassadors and the dictation of diplomatic letters. He would have learned the delicate art of Amorite diplomacy, how to discern threats from bluffs, when to offer an alliance, and how to use espionage to anticipate a rival's moves. As he grew older, he would have accompanied his father on military campaigns, learning the logistics of supplying an army and the tactics of siege warfare firsthand. This was no sheltered upbringing. It was a comprehensive, state-sponsored program designed to create a master of administration, diplomacy, and war. A king prepared not just to survive, but to prevail. To comprehend the authority of a Mesopotamian king, one must understand that kingship itself was not considered a human political invention, but a fundamental component of the cosmic order, an institution created by the gods and lowered from heaven at the dawn of time. The Sumerian king list, a foundational document of Mesopotamian political thought, states this explicitly in its opening line. The monarch was not a god himself, a distinction that separated Mesopotamian ideology from that of pharaonic Egypt, but he was the chosen agent of the gods on earth, a unique intermediary who stood at the critical juncture between the divine and mortal realms. His primary function was to maintain the delicate balance of the cosmos, to ensure that the human world operated in accordance with the divine principles of order and justice, known in Akkadian as Kitum Masharum. This was not merely a legal or social responsibility, it was a sacred cosmological duty. The most pervasive and powerful metaphor for this role was that of the shepherd, the Reum, and his people were the flock. This was not a title of humility, but one of profound responsibility. The king, as the shepherd, was tasked with guiding and protecting his people, ensuring their well-being, and defending them from both internal chaos and external threats. His success in this role was a direct reflection of his standing with the gods. Bountiful harvests, victory in battle, economic prosperity, and internal stability were not seen as the results of sound policy alone, but as tangible evidence of divine favor. Conversely, famine, plague, military defeat, or social unrest were interpreted as signs that the king had failed in his duties and had lost the support of the divine assembly, a perilous position that could invite usurpation by a rival who could claim to be the new true choice of the gods. This divine mandate manifested in a series of concrete obligations. The king was the chief builder and maintainer of the gods' earthly estates, the temples. The construction and lavish adornment of these sanctuaries were paramount royal duties, ensuring the gods would remain content within their cult centers and continue to bless the city. He was also the chief hydraulic engineer, responsible for the construction and maintenance of the vast network of canals that irrigated the land, a task seen as a direct collaboration with the gods to ensure the land's fertility. His authority was therefore absolute, but it was not arbitrary. It was contingent upon his successful performance as the steward of the gods' creation. This entire ideological framework was the ultimate source of law. When a king issued edicts or, in the case of Hammurabi, promulgated a comprehensive code, he was not simply creating human legislation. He was fulfilling his most essential divine function, to translate the abstract principles of cosmic justice into a concrete, enforceable system that would order human society and, in doing so, prove his worthiness to hold the divine mandate. In 1792 BCE, upon the abdication of his ailing father, Sin-Muballit, Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon. He was a young man, his exact age unknown, but likely in his late teens or early 20s, inheriting leadership of a kingdom that was stable but strategically insignificant. His ascension would have been noted in the courts of his rivals, but it would not have caused alarm. He was an unproven entity in a world dominated by seasoned, powerful monarchs, the giants of his age. To the south, the formidable Rim-Sin I of Larsa was in the 53rd year of his reign, an elder statesman of immense prestige who had spent decades consolidating his control over the ancient heartland of Sumer. His kingdom was wealthy, his army was battle-hardened, and his diplomatic reach was extensive. For Babylon, Larsa was a constant and looming threat, a superior power that demanded deference. To the north, the political map was dominated by the vast territorial state created by the military genius Shamshi-Adad I. From his capital at Shubat-Enlil, he controlled all of Upper Mesopotamia, a sprawling domain that effectively encircled Babylon's northern and western flanks. Shamshi-Adad was at the zenith of his power, a self-styled king of all who treated other rulers not as brothers but as vassals. He had installed his sons as viceroys in key cities, the capable and ruthless Ishmi-Dagan in Ekalatum on the Tigris, and the less competent Yazma-Adu in the great city of Mari on the Euphrates. For the young Hammurabi, this northern empire was a geopolitical cage, limiting his options for expansion and forcing him into a subordinate relationship. Any sign of Babylonian ambition would be met with swift retribution from a king who did not tolerate insubordination. To the east lay the powerful and often aggressive kingdom of Eshnunna, and further afield the Elamites, a perennial threat from the Iranian plateau. Caught in this geopolitical vice, Hammurabi's position was profoundly precarious. His kingdom was a small island in a sea of giants. His army, while well organized, was a fraction of the size of those commanded by Rim-Sin or Shamshi-Adad. His treasury was modest, and his diplomatic leverage was virtually non-existent. The correspondence from the Mari archives makes it clear that in these early years, Shamshi-Adad viewed Hammurabi with a degree of condescension, referring to him as the man of Babylon, rather than affording him the full honors of a great king. The ascension of this young, untested ruler was seen not as the dawn of a new era, but as a minor event, the continuation of a minor dynasty in a world whose fate was being decided by much greater men. Faced with a world of powerful rivals, the young Hammurabi did not begin his reign with the clang of arms or bold territorial expansion. Instead, the first 3 decades of his rule were a masterclass in strategic patience and internal consolidation. The primary historical sources for this period, the official year names assigned to each year of his reign, are revealing. They do not speak of great conquests, but of pious and practical acts of governance. Year 2 is named for his issuance of a Misharim edict, a royal decree of justice that typically involved the cancellation of non-commercial debts and the manumission of citizens who had fallen into debt servitude. This was a critical act of statecraft, a way to ensure social stability, curb the power of creditors, and win the loyalty of the general populace at the very start of his reign. Subsequent year names record the meticulous work of a king strengthening his foundations. The construction of city walls for Borsippa and Sippar, the fashioning of magnificent cult objects and thrones for the gods Marduk and Zarpanit, and the excavation of vital new canals, which he named Hammurabi, is the abundance of the people. In the international arena, Hammurabi played the part of a loyal and unthreatening subordinate. The vast correspondence unearthed at Mari confirms that he was a vassal, albeit a significant one, within the political orbit of the northern hegemon Shamshi-Adad I. He dutifully sent Babylonian troops to support his overlord's campaigns, participated in the complex exchange of diplomatic gifts, and maintained a constant flow of messengers to the courts of his powerful neighbors. This was a period of intense learning. Every diplomatic letter, every request for military aid, every report from his envoys was an opportunity to gather intelligence. He was building a detailed understanding of the personalities, resources, and internal weaknesses of the great kings who surrounded him. The Amorite courts of this era were hotbeds of espionage, where ambassadors often doubled as spies, and the constant traffic of merchants and messengers provided cover for intelligence gathering. Hammurabi was an active participant in this great game, meticulously building his network and assessing his rivals' capabilities. He made no move to challenge the established order. For nearly 30 years, he was the model vassal to the north and the deferential neighbor to the south. He focused his resources inward, building a prosperous, stable, and well-defended kingdom, while carefully avoiding any action that might provoke a premature confrontation with the giants of Larsa or Upper Mesopotamia. This long period of apparent quiescence was not a sign of weakness, but of profound strategic discipline. Hammurabi was biding his time, strengthening his state from within, and waiting for the inevitable moment when the colossal but brittle empires of his rivals would begin to show cracks. His early reign was the essential, unglamorous groundwork, the decades of quiet preparation that would enable the lightning conquests of his later years. The catalyst that unleashed Hammurabi's ambition was the death of the northern emperor, Shamshi-Adad I, around 1776 BCE. The vast but personally held empire he had forged immediately began to fracture. His less capable sons could not command the loyalty of the diverse city-states their father had subjugated, and the northern political landscape disintegrated into a constellation of smaller, weaker kingdoms. This power vacuum fundamentally altered the strategic map, and after 30 years of patient preparation, Hammurabi seized his moment. His first major move was not north but south. He joined a grand coalition of states, including his long-standing ally Zimri-Lim of Mari, aimed at finally breaking the power of the elderly king Rim-Sin I of Larsa. This was not a war of Babylonian conquest, but a carefully managed alliance where Hammurabi presented himself as a liberator of Sumerian cities from Larsa's long dominion. The campaign, culminating in 1763 BCE, was a masterpiece of coalition warfare. After a prolonged siege, Larsa fell, and Rim-Sin was captured. Hammurabi had eliminated his most powerful southern rival. With the south secured, he immediately pivoted. The very next year, 1762 BCE, his year name records the defeat of the armies of Eshnunna, Maljum, and the Subatu lands to the north. His military machine, honed by decades of internal development and now flush with the resources of the conquered south, proved devastatingly effective. He moved with a speed and decisiveness that stunned his contemporaries. The alliances that had defined the region for half a century were shattered in a matter of months. His most ruthless and decisive action was yet to come. Zimri-Lim of Mari, his faithful ally in the war against Larsa, now ruled a prosperous and independent kingdom on the Middle Euphrates. In 1761 BCE, in a stunning act of political betrayal that is still debated by historians, Hammurabi marched his army against his former partner. The pretext for the war is lost, but the outcome was clear. Mari was conquered, its great palace sacked, and its fortifications dismantled. 2 years later, in 1759 BCE, Hammurabi returned and razed the city to the ground, an act of utter destruction intended to send an unequivocal message to any other potential rivals. Within a span of just 5 years, from 1763 to 1759 BCE, Hammurabi had systematically defeated every major power in Mesopotamia. Through a brilliant series of lightning campaigns, leveraging shifting alliances and ruthless pragmatism, the patient vassal had transformed himself into the undisputed master of the entire region. The minor power on the Euphrates now stood at the head of a new empire, the first true Babylonian empire, unifying the lands of Sumer and Akkad under a single ruler for the first time in centuries. Military victory was only the first, and perhaps the easiest, part of forging an empire. With the lands of Sumer and Akkad now under his dominion, Hammurabi faced a far more complex challenge, transforming a patchwork of conquered city-states, each with its own laws, customs, and pantheon, into a coherent and governable realm. The swiftness of his campaigns had left him with a vast territory that was politically unified in name only. His immediate task was to shift from the role of conqueror to that of a supreme administrator, a process that required a complete reordering of the state apparatus. The old system of vassalage and shifting alliances was obsolete. Direct imperial control was the new imperative. Hammurabi's primary instrument for this consolidation was the establishment of a centralized bureaucracy, operated from Babylon, but with officials posted throughout the empire. He installed trusted governors, or shakanaku, in the major conquered cities. These were not local nobles co-opted into the new regime, but Babylonian officials, often from his own court, whose loyalty was to the king alone. Their function was to oversee local administration, ensure the collection of taxes, and serve as the king's eyes and ears. To support them and to guarantee the security of his new territories, he established permanent garrisons of Babylonian soldiers in key strategic locations. These were not armies of occupation in a modern sense, but a constant, visible reminder of where ultimate authority now resided. To knit his diverse realm together economically, Hammurabi initiated a series of critical standardizations. He imposed a unified calendar across the empire, a seemingly simple act that was in fact a profound assertion of central authority, as it synchronized agricultural festivals and, more importantly, the schedule for tax collection. He also worked to standardize weights and measures, facilitating commerce and ensuring that tribute and taxes were assessed according to a single royally mandated system. His administration took a direct interest in the economies of the conquered states, particularly the immense wealth of the great temple households. Hammurabi did not dismantle these ancient institutions, but he effectively nationalized them, diverting a significant portion of their revenue from local cults to the central treasury in Babylon. His surviving correspondence, a trove of letters dictated by the king himself, reveals a ruler obsessed with the minutiae of governance. He personally adjudicated disputes over land tenure in Larsa, ordered the dredging of a canal near Ur, and arranged for the transfer of officials from one end of his kingdom to the other. This was the unglamorous, essential work of empire building, creating a unified administrative, economic, and legal space where once there had only been a collection of rival cities. This immense project of consolidation was the necessary foundation for his most enduring legacy. The administrative and economic consolidation of Hammurabi's new empire, while essential, addressed only the mechanics of control. A deeper, more fundamental challenge remained: the problem of justice itself. The empire was not a blank slate upon which a new order could be easily inscribed. It was a palimpsest of ancient and deeply rooted legal traditions. For centuries, every major city-state from Larsa to Mari had operated according to its own distinct body of laws and customs, its own judicial precedents, and its own unique schedule of penalties and compensations. A commercial dispute that would be resolved one way in the courts of Ur might have a completely different outcome in Sippar. The inheritance rights of a daughter could vary dramatically from one city to the next. This legal pluralism, once a natural feature of independent states, was now a critical impediment to the functioning of a unified empire. This patchwork of legal systems created a landscape of uncertainty and inefficiency that threatened the very cohesion of the state. For Hammurabi's newly installed governors, it was an administrative quagmire. How were they to adjudicate a property dispute between a man from Babylon and a woman from a newly conquered Sumerian city when their native legal traditions offered conflicting resolutions? Applying Babylonian law would be seen as an act of imperial arrogance, while deferring to local custom would undermine the principle of central authority. For commerce, the lifeblood of the empire, this legal diversity was a constant source of friction. A merchant needed assurance that a contract signed in one part of the realm would be honored and enforced in another. Without a predictable empire-wide legal framework, long-distance trade remained a high-risk venture, stifling the economic integration that Hammurabi's other reforms were designed to encourage. Beyond these practical concerns, the multiplicity of laws represented a profound political challenge. Local legal traditions were a primary source of identity and autonomy for the conquered cities. Their courts, often administered by temple officials or councils of elders, were ancient institutions that commanded the loyalty of the populace. To allow these disparate systems to continue operating was to permit the existence of competing sources of authority, a direct contradiction of the principle of absolute monarchy. The empire required a single supreme source of justice, and that source had to be the king. The creation of a unified law code was therefore not merely an act of legal reform, it was a revolutionary political act. It was designed to supersede all local traditions, to replace the authority of city elders and temple priests with the direct, unmediated authority of the Babylonian state. It was the final, indispensable step in the transformation of Hammurabi from a conqueror of cities into the sole lawgiver for a unified people. To legitimize a legal system intended to supersede all local traditions, Hammurabi required an authority that transcended his own political and military power. The solution lay in a carefully constructed theological argument that framed the law code not as a product of human reason, but as a direct commission from the divine source of justice itself. For this role, there could be only one choice among the Mesopotamian pantheon, the god Shamash. While Anu was the king of the gods and Enlil wielded the power of command, Shamash held a unique and vital position as the ultimate arbiter of truth and righteousness. As the sun god, his daily journey across the sky allowed him to see all things, to witness every transaction, every crime, and every act of oppression that occurred in the world below. Nothing was hidden from his all-seeing gaze, making him the supreme judge, the divine embodiment of the very principles of Kitam Umisharam, truth and justice. Shamash was not merely a passive observer, he was an active force in the universe. He was the god who illuminated darkness, both literal and metaphorical, revealing that which was hidden and bringing truth to light. In legal disputes, oaths were sworn in his name, as it was believed that Shamash would punish any who perjured themselves. He was the patron deity of divination, the practice of discerning the divine will and future events, because his light could penetrate the veil of uncertainty. His primary cult centers at Sippar and Larsa were also renowned as centers of justice, where judges were considered to be acting as his earthly representatives. By framing his law code as a commission from Shamash, Hammurabi was making a profound theological and political statement. He was claiming that these laws were not his own invention, not a reflection of Babylonian custom imposed upon a conquered populace, but rather the earthly manifestation of a divine and universal standard of justice. This divine commission is immortalized in the iconic relief sculpture at the very top of the diorite stele. In the scene, Hammurabi stands in a posture of pious reverence before the enthroned god. Shamash, identified by the solar rays emanating from his shoulders, is depicted in the act of extending to the king two objects, a ring and a staff. These are not a scepter and crown, the symbols of kingship, which Hammurabi already possessed. They are the rod and line, the tools of a surveyor or architect, the instruments used to measure straight lines and right angles. Their symbolism is unmistakable. Shamash is bestowing upon the king the divine tools necessary to measure the deeds of men, to establish a straight and righteous order in society. Hammurabi is not being crowned. He is being divinely licensed as the supreme judge of his people. The code that is inscribed below this image is therefore presented as the direct result of this sacred encounter. It is the written record of the justice that Shamash has commanded Hammurabi to implement, giving the laws an absolute cosmic authority that no local tradition or political rival could dare to challenge. The decision to create a monumental and permanent record of the law required a medium that conveyed both authority and permanence, a substance fundamentally alien to the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia. The entire region, a landscape built of river-borne silt, was devoid of hard stone. To create his monument, Hammurabi had to organize a state-level expedition to source a material worthy of his ambition. The material chosen was diorite, a hard, dark, igneous rock. This was not an arbitrary choice. Diorite is exceptionally durable, resistant to erosion and weathering, making it the ideal medium for a text intended to last for eternity. Its dark, almost black, color gave it a somber gravitas, and its rarity in Mesopotamia made it an object of immense prestige. Furthermore, its extreme hardness made it incredibly difficult to work with the bronze tools of the era, meaning that any object carved from it was an explicit and costly demonstration of royal power and technological mastery. The most likely source for such a massive, high-quality boulder of diorite was the Zagros Mountains, the great mountain range forming the eastern frontier of Mesopotamia, in lands that were either recently conquered or under firm Babylonian control. The first step would have been a geological survey, a mission for royal agents tasked with locating a suitable outcrop. They would have searched for a stone free of internal fractures or imperfections, a single monolithic block large enough to accommodate the extensive text and the divine relief sculpture. Once a suitable boulder was identified, the true logistical challenge began. Quarrying a multi-ton block of diorite with 18th century BCE technology was a monumental undertaking. Teams of specialized laborers would have worked for months, using a combination of techniques. They would have painstakingly pounded the rock with harder stone dolerite balls, slowly pulverizing the surrounding material. They may also have used fire setting, heating the rock with massive bonfires, and then rapidly cooling it with water to create cracks, and then driving wooden wedges into these cracks and soaking them, causing the wood to expand and split the stone. The transportation of the quarried block was an even greater feat of engineering and administration. The journey from the Zagros foothills to Babylon was a distance of hundreds of kilometers, across rugged terrain, rivers, and plains. The massive stone would have been carefully loaded onto a heavy-duty wooden sledge, a vehicle requiring an immense team of oxen and laborers to pull. Roads would have been cleared and leveled in its path, and temporary ramps constructed to navigate difficult inclines. The most critical part of the journey would have been the transfer of the stone to a barge on a major river or canal for the final leg to Babylon. This operation alone, involving the careful maneuvering of a multi-ton, irregularly shaped object onto a specially constructed vessel, would have been a perilous and complex engineering problem. The entire process, from survey to delivery, was a massive state project, a clear demonstration of the empire's reach and its king's ability to command and organize immense human and material resources to create a single perfect object of eternal law. Once the immense block of diorite arrived in the capital, it was delivered not to a common workshop, but to a specialized royally funded facility where the empire's most accomplished artisans were assembled. The creation of the stele was a state project of the highest priority, a synthesis of the most advanced technical skills and intellectual currents of the age. The first task fell to the master sculptors, a small elite group of craftsmen whose expertise was in working with hard stone. Their initial challenge was to prepare the surface, transforming the rough-hewn boulder into a perfectly smooth cylindrical canvas. This was an arduous process of grinding and polishing that would have taken months, using progressively finer abrasive materials, likely sand and emery, to achieve a flawless, light-absorbing finish. With the surface prepared, they began the delicate work of carving the relief at the top. The bronze chisels and tools that were effective on softer stones like limestone or alabaster were all but useless against the unyielding hardness of diorite. The sculptors relied instead on a laborious technique of abrasion and percussion. They would have used drills, likely bow drills tipped with copper or bronze bits, not to cut the stone directly, but to create depressions that could be filled with an abrasive slurry. By patiently working the drill, they could slowly grind away the material. For the fine lines of Hammurabi's robe, or the intricate details of Shamash's tiered crown, they would have used flint or obsidian tools and more pounding with dolerite hammerstones. This was a process measured in millimeters per day, requiring a level of patience and precision that is difficult to comprehend. Every detail was a testament to countless hours of painstaking labor. Concurrently, the intellectual heart of the project resided with the master scribes and legal scholars of the court. The final text of the code was not a simple transcription. It was the culmination of a massive editorial project. A council of experts would have gathered, collated, and revised existing laws from across Mesopotamia, adapting them to fit Hammurabi's specific political and social aims. The final text, approved by the king himself, was then passed to the chief lapidary scribe. This individual faced a daunting challenge of graphic design, laying out over 4,000 lines of cuneiform text onto the curved surface of the stele. He had to meticulously calculate the size of each character and the spacing of each line to ensure the entire text would fit perfectly within the allotted space, organized into neat vertical columns. The actual inscription was then carried out by a team of specialized stone carvers. These were not the same artists who created the relief, but artisans with the specific skill of rendering cuneiform signs in stone. Each wedge and line was carefully chiseled or ground into the polished diorite, a task requiring a steady hand and immense concentration. The remarkable consistency of the script across the entire monument, with its uniform depth and sharp edges, speaks to a highly standardized and disciplined workshop practice. The entire project, from the first grinding of the stone to the final incised character, was a collaborative masterpiece, a fusion of artistic vision, technical mastery, and profound intellectual labor, all marshaled by the will of the state to create an object of eternal authority. With the monumental relief of king and god completed, and the vast surface of the diorite stele polished to a dark luster, the project entered its most intellectually and technically demanding phase, the physical inscription of the law. This was a task that required a seamless transition from the abstract authority of the legal scholar to the concrete skill of the lapidary artisan. The chief scribe's meticulously planned layout, likely drafted on papyrus scrolls or large clay tablets, now had to be transferred onto the unforgiving stone. This initial step was likely accomplished using a temporary pigment, perhaps a fine chalk or gypsum paste, with which a master scribe would painstakingly draw each of the thousands of cuneiform characters onto the curved surface. Every sign, every column divider, and every margin had to be rendered with perfect accuracy, as this temporary guide would be the only map for the stone carvers to follow. The artisans entrusted with the inscription were a distinct and highly specialized group. The act of carving cuneiform into diorite was fundamentally different from impressing it into clay. The characteristic wedge shape, so easily produced by a stylus in a soft medium, had to be laboriously ground and abraded out of one of the hardest stones known to the ancient world. The carvers would have used a variety of tools, including fine-tipped bronze points, but these would have served more to guide the work than to cut it, as they would dull almost instantly against the diorite. The primary tools were likely hardened flint burins and obsidian blades, used to scratch and scrape away the stone, particle by particle. The process was one of slow, controlled abrasion, not of chipping or chiseling. Each of the hundreds of distinct cuneiform signs was composed of a specific arrangement of wedges. The carver had to replicate these forms with absolute fidelity, maintaining a consistent depth, angle, and sharpness for every single impression. A slight tremor of the hand, a moment of lapsed concentration, could ruin a character, forcing a time-consuming process of repolishing the immediate area. The work would have been deafening and dusty, the workshop filled with the high-pitched squeak of hard stone on hard stone, a sound that would have continued day after day for many months. This was not writing in a conventional sense. It was the micro-sculpting of a legal universe. The sheer scale of the undertaking is staggering. The stele contains 51 columns of text, comprising nearly 4,000 lines. Given the difficulty of the material, it is estimated that a single carver might only complete a few lines of text in a full day's work. The project therefore required a team of the empire's finest lapidary craftsmen, all working in a highly disciplined and coordinated fashion to ensure uniformity across the monument. The final result was an object where the medium and the method were integral to the message. The permanence of the diorite, combined with the immense, painstaking labour required to inscribe it, physically embodied the authority and eternal validity of the laws it proclaimed. Before a single law is read, the stele presents its entire argument in a single, masterful image. The relief sculpture at the top of the monument is not decorative. It is a concise and powerful piece of visual theology, a pictorial prologue that establishes the ultimate source and authority of the text below. The scene is one of divine investiture, a direct and personal transmission of power from the celestial to the terrestrial realm. The composition is dominated by two figures. On the right, seated on a throne whose base is rendered to resemble the facade of a temple, is the great god Shamash. His divinity is unmistakable, marked by the conventional attributes of Mesopotamian iconography. A magnificent, tiered, horned crown signifies his high rank in the pantheon, and divine rays of light emanate from his shoulders, the specific and undeniable symbol of the sun god. He is depicted as a majestic, bearded figure, his feet resting upon a representation of mountains, signifying his cosmic domain. Facing him on the left is the mortal king, Hammurabi. His depiction is a careful study in political ideology. He is not prostrate or kneeling, but stands before the god, a posture that conveys his status as a ruler in his own right, worthy of a direct audience. Yet, he is not the god's equal. His hand is raised to his mouth in a gesture of piety and respect, the traditional pose of a human acknowledging divine majesty. He wears the simple robe and cap of a king, not the elaborate regalia of a priest, emphasizing that his authority is secular, even as its source is divine. The critical action of the scene is the transfer of two objects from Shamash to Hammurabi, the rod and the ring. These are not symbols of kingship, but the measuring rod and coiled rope of a surveyor, the tools used to ensure straight lines and right angles in construction. Their meaning is profound. The god of justice is physically handing the king the divine instruments necessary to measure human conduct and to build an ordered, righteous society. The entire scene is a visual contract, a public and permanent record of the divine commission. It argues, more powerfully than words alone, that the laws inscribed below are not the arbitrary inventions of a mortal conqueror. They are the earthly expression of a universal cosmic standard of justice, revealed by the supreme judge of the universe to his chosen earthly agent. The iconography establishes an unbroken chain of authority, flowing directly from the god to the king, and from the king to the people, through the medium of the written law. It is a masterful work of propaganda, designed to be understood by literate and illiterate alike, a divine seal of approval that precedes and validates every one of the nearly 300 laws that follow. The visual argument presented in the stella's relief is immediately followed and expanded upon by a lengthy textual prologue written in a high literary style of Old Babylonian Akkadian. This section, comprising the first 5 columns of the inscription, is a masterpiece of political theology, a meticulously crafted manifesto designed to establish the unassailable legitimacy of both the king and his laws. It begins at the dawn of time, invoking the supreme gods of the pantheon, Anu the Most High and Enlil, Lord of heaven and earth, the deities who determined the destinies of the land. The prologue asserts that these primordial gods made a momentous decision. They elevated Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, to a position of preeminence over all of humanity. This was a radical theological move. In one stroke, Hammurabi's scribes demoted the ancient and revered Enlil of Nippur, and declared that the god of their own city was now the supreme power in the human world, a divine justification for Babylon's new imperial status. Having established Marduk's supremacy, The text then states that it was this new supreme god, in concert with Anu and Enlil, who specifically named Hammurabi for his great task. The text is explicit about the king's divine mission: to make justice prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak, and to rise like Shamash over the black-headed people, to illuminate the land. This is the core of Hammurabi's claim to authority. He is not a conqueror acting out of personal ambition, but a divinely appointed instrument of social justice, the chosen agent tasked with bringing light and order to the world. To reinforce this claim, the prologue recites a long list of Hammurabi's royal titles, each one highlighting a different facet of his ideal kingship. He is the pious prince, the shepherd of the people, the wise king, and the son of Babylon. The text then transitions from theological claims to a recitation of the king's historical deeds, framing his military conquests as acts of piety. He lists the great cities of his new empire: Nippur, Eridu, Ur, Larsa, Sippar, and describes how he has restored their temples, re-established their proper cults, and brought peace and prosperity to their inhabitants. This section serves a critical political purpose. It co-opts the history and religious prestige of the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian centers, presenting Hammurabi not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate and pious caretaker of all Mesopotamian tradition. By the end of the prologue, the argument is complete and unassailable. The highest gods have appointed Marduk. Marduk has appointed Hammurabi, and Hammurabi has proven his worthiness through his pious deeds. The laws that follow are therefore not merely the edicts of a successful warlord, but the necessary and righteous fulfillment of a divine commission to establish a perfect and lasting order on earth. The completion of the great diorite stele was not the culmination of the project, but merely the prelude to its true purpose: public proclamation. An object of such immense political and religious significance could not be hidden away in a palace chamber. It was conceived and created as a public monument, a permanent and accessible embodiment of the king's justice. The primary location chosen for its installation was the most sacred and politically charged space in the new empire: the Esagila, the great temple complex of the god Marduk in the heart of Babylon. Placing the monument here was a deliberate and powerful act. It physically situated the king's law within the god's own house, reinforcing the theological argument of the prologue that this justice flowed directly from the city's supreme deity. The stele became, in effect, a new cult object, a testament to the divine partnership between Marduk and his chosen shepherd, Hammurabi. The physical act of moving the finished, multi-ton monument into the temple precinct would have been a major state ceremony, a carefully orchestrated piece of public theatre. The stele would have been transported on rollers or a massive sledge pulled by hundreds of labourers through the main processional way of Babylon, accompanied by priests, royal officials, and soldiers. Its installation in a prominent public courtyard of the temple complex made it accessible to the populace. While the vast majority of Hammurabi's subjects were illiterate, the monument's function was not solely dependent on their ability to read the cuneiform text. Its sheer physical presence, the rare and costly diorite, the masterful sculpture, and the overwhelming density of the inscription was a powerful, non-verbal statement of the king's power and his commitment to justice. It was a tangible anchor for the abstract concept of law. For the literate, and for those who needed to consult it, the stele was a definitive legal reference. It is almost certain that scribes or temple officials were tasked with reading relevant sections aloud to any citizen who came before them with a dispute. An aggrieved farmer or a merchant involved in a contract dispute could appeal to the words of the king on the stone, having them recited by an official to clarify a point of law. This transformed justice from a matter of local custom or a judge's personal discretion into a standardized, royally mandated system. Furthermore, the epilogue of the code makes it clear that this was not the only such monument. Hammurabi explicitly states his intention for his laws to be read and honored in the temples throughout his land. It is highly probable that other, perhaps smaller stelae were commissioned and sent to the great temples of the conquered cities, Sippar, Nippur, Lhasa, and The act of placing a Babylonian legal monument in the sacred heart of these ancient and once independent cities was the final indelible act of imperial consolidation, a constant and public proclamation that the old local orders were gone, replaced by a single, unified justice flowing from the king in Babylon. Following the grand theological and political claims of the prologue, the stele transitions to the legal core of the monument, the laws themselves. To a modern reader, the structure of these nearly 300 regulations can seem archaic and unsystematic, but they are in fact organized according to a consistent and highly practical logic that defined all ancient Near Eastern jurisprudence. The code is not a collection of abstract universal commands, such as "thou shalt not kill" or "thou shalt not steal." Instead, every single law is formulated in a casuistic or case law structure. Each provision takes the form of a conditional sentence. If a certain event occurs, then a specific legal consequence follows. This "if," then, formula is the fundamental building block of the entire code. This casuistic approach reveals the code's origins and its intended function. It was not a philosophical treatise on the nature of justice, but a practical manual for resolving specific, recurring disputes that arose in a complex urban and agricultural society. The laws read like a compilation of judicial precedents. For example, the code does not simply forbid theft, it presents a series of specific scenarios. Law Scrate states, if a man has stolen an ox, a sheep, a donkey, a pig, or a boat, if it belongs to a god or to the palace, he shall pay 30-fold. If it belongs to a commoner, he shall pay 10-fold. If the thief has nothing to pay, he shall be put to death. Each clause is triggered by a precise set of circumstances: the item stolen, the status of the owner, and the thief's ability to pay restitution. This specificity was the system's great strength. It provided judges throughout the empire with a concrete guide, a royally sanctioned reference book for the types of cases they were most likely to encounter. This structure also meant that the code was not, and was never intended to be, a comprehensive legal system that covered every possible crime. It is highly selective, focusing on areas of common contention such as property rights, commercial contracts, family law, and professional liability. There are entire categories of what modern law would consider essential that are absent from the code. Its purpose was not to be exhaustive, but to be exemplary. By providing a clear ruling on a specific case, it established a principle that could be applied to similar, analogous situations. While the arrangement of the laws can appear haphazard, scholars have identified a clear thematic organization. The code begins with offenses against the administration of justice, such as false accusation and judicial corruption, before moving methodically through sections on property crime, land tenure, commercial law, family law, assault, and regulations governing various professions. This logical, if not explicitly labeled, grouping demonstrates that the code was a carefully edited and organized document, a rational and pragmatic tool designed to bring a standardized and predictable form of royal justice to the diverse peoples of a newly forged empire. The most famous and revolutionary aspect of Hammurabi's code is its prominent use of the principle of retaliation, or lex talionis. This legal philosophy marks a stark and deliberate break from the older Sumerian tradition of compensatory justice, where the codes of Ur-Nammu and Lipit Ishtar had prescribed monetary fines for acts of physical violence. Hammurabi's laws introduced a new and formidable standard of symmetrical, state-sanctioned retribution. This was a legal innovation with profound social and political implications, designed to curb the endless cycle of private vengeance and blood feuds that plagued ancient societies. By making the state the sole agent of retaliation, the code aimed to limit and formalize punishment, ensuring it was proportional to the original offense and not an escalating series of private attacks. The clearest expressions of this principle are found in the section on assault. Law Scone 196 states, with brutal clarity, If an awilum has destroyed the eye of another awilum, his eye shall be destroyed. Law Scone 197 follows. If he has broken the bone of another awilum, his bone shall be broken. Law 200 is equally direct. If an awilum has knocked out the tooth of an awilum of his own rank, his tooth shall be knocked out. This is the famous eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth standard. The use of the term awilum, meaning a full citizen or patrician, is critical. The principle of direct physical retaliation was, in its strictest sense, a law that applied only between social equals within the highest tier of society. It was a mechanism to regulate violence among the elite, where insults to honor were most likely to trigger destructive feuds. However, this symmetry of punishment vanished when the offense crossed class lines. The code makes this distinction explicit. Law Scone 198 states, if he has destroyed the eye of a mushkanum, a commoner or state dependent, or broken the bone of a mushkanum, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. The injury is the same, but the social status of the victim fundamentally alters the legal consequence, replacing physical retaliation with a financial penalty. The disparity is even greater in the case of a slave, wardum. Law C-199 dictates that if a man destroys the eye or breaks the bone of another man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 of the slave's market value to the slave's owner. The slave's physical body is treated not as a person deserving of reciprocal justice, but as the damaged property of his master. This stratified application of lex talionis reveals the code's dual purpose. It was a tool for limiting violence, but it was also an instrument for reinforcing the rigid social hierarchy of the Babylonian state. Justice was not blind, it was acutely aware of social status, and the penalty for a crime was measured not only by the act itself, but by the social worth of the victim. The legal framework of Hammurabi's empire was built upon a foundation of rigid social stratification. Babylonian society was not a homogeneous mass of subjects, but a precisely ordered hierarchy, formally divided into 3 distinct legal classes: the awilum, the mushkanum, and the wardum. These were not merely social distinctions. They were fundamental legal categories that determined an individual's rights, responsibilities, and value in the eyes of the state. Every application of the law, from commercial contracts to criminal penalties, was filtered through this tripartite system. At the apex of this hierarchy was the awilum, a term best translated as patrician or full citizen. This class comprised the elite of Babylonian society, the great landowning families, high-ranking priests, senior military officers, and wealthy merchants. The defining characteristic of an awilum was his independence and his full participation in the civic life of the city. He was a man of property, a patriarch who headed a household, and a citizen with a voice in the local assembly. The code afforded the awilum the greatest legal protections, but also held him to the highest standard of accountability. It was primarily between members of this class that the principle of direct physical retaliation, lex talionis, was applied. An offence against an awilum by an equal demanded a symmetrical punishment, a legal recognition of his high social worth. Below the awilum was the mushkanum, a more ambiguous and heavily debated social category. They were not slaves, but free persons who lacked the full status and independence of the awilum. The term likely refers to a broad class of commoners or dependents, people who were reliant on the palace or the temple for their livelihood. This group would have included landless tenant farmers, artisans working in state-run workshops, and low-level functionaries in the bureaucracy. While they could own property and participate in commerce, their legal standing was significantly diminished. As the laws on assault demonstrate, an injury to a mushkanum was not avenged with physical retaliation, but compensated with a fixed monetary fine, explicitly valuing their physical personhood at less than that of an awilum. At the bottom of the social pyramid was the wardum, the slave. An individual could enter this class through several avenues. Being captured in war was the most common, but citizens could also be sold into slavery to pay off debts, or be born into it as the child of a slave mother. The wardum was, in the eyes of the law, primarily an item of property. He or she could be bought, sold, branded, and inherited. The code is filled with laws protecting the property rights of a slave owner, prescribing harsh penalties for anyone who harbored a fugitive slave or disputed a master's ownership. Yet the Babylonian slave was not entirely without legal recognition. The code includes provisions allowing a wardem to participate in business and, under certain circumstances, to accumulate personal property. A slave could even marry a free person, and their children would be born free. This complex three-tiered structure was the unshakable bedrock of Hammurabi's justice. It was a system designed not to create equality, but to maintain a divinely ordained social order, where every individual had a fixed place, and the law served to reinforce the boundaries between them. The legal world of the Awilum was one of supreme protection, matched by severe accountability. The code is, in many respects, a document written by and for this patrician class, meticulously defining and defending the pillars of their social and economic power. The foremost of these pillars was property. Numerous laws are dedicated to the protection of an Awilum's estate, which primarily consisted of land, livestock, and the labor of others. The penalties for infringing upon these property rights were draconian. Law C6, for instance, decrees that if a man steals the property of a god, or the palace institutions invariably run by the Awilum class, he shall be put to death, and anyone who receives the stolen goods from him shall also be put to death. This provision effectively created a zone of absolute protection around the assets of the state and temple, the collective wealth of the elite. The code also delves into the complexities of land tenure specific to the patrician class, particularly for soldiers and officials granted land by the crown in return for their service. These laws are designed to prevent the alienation of state-granted land, ensuring that this economic foundation of the military and administrative elite remains intact. The second pillar of an Awilum's status was the integrity of his family and the honor of his household. The code dedicates a significant section to family law, and its provisions for the elite are particularly strict. The value placed on the fidelity of an Awilum's wife was absolute. Law Scone 129 states that if the wife of an Awilum is caught lying with another man, they shall bind them and cast them into the water. This sentence of death by drowning for both parties, unless the husband chose to pardon his wife, underscores the gravity of adultery as an offense against the patriarchal order of the elite. The laws of inheritance were similarly detailed, designed to ensure the orderly transfer of an Awilum's estate to his legitimate heirs, thereby preserving the wealth and continuity of the great families. However, this privileged legal status was a double-edged sword. If the code offered the Awilum unparalleled protection, it also held him to a uniquely high standard of professional and civic liability. The famous laws concerning builders and surgeons are prime examples. Law Stack 229 is chillingly specific. If a builder has built a house for an Awilum and has not made his work strong, and the house he built has fallen and caused the death of the owner of the house, that builder shall be put to death. If it killed the owner's son, the builder's son was to be put to death, a stark application of vicarious talionic justice. Similarly, a surgeon who performed a major operation on an Awilum with a bronze lancet and caused his death or destroyed his eye would have his hands cut off. 218. For the powerful, justice was a system of high stakes. Their lives and bodies were valued most, but their failures and professional negligence were punished with the utmost severity, a brutal mechanism for ensuring the quality and accountability of the services upon which the elite depended. The legal identity of the Mushkanum is that of a person caught between the privilege of the patrician and the property status of the slave. This class of commoners, likely comprising the majority of the empire's free population, lived in a world of diminished legal standing, a reality meticulously codified in Hammurabi's laws. While they were free individuals, their relationship with the state was one of dependency, which fundamentally altered the application of justice. The code consistently values their physical well-being and property at a fraction of that of an awilum. This is most evident in the laws of assault, where an awilum who lost an eye could demand the eye of his attacker. A mushkanum who suffered the same injury received only a monetary payment of 1 mina of silver. His bodily integrity was not a matter of honor demanding symmetrical retribution, but a quantifiable economic asset with a state-mandated price. This principle of reduced value extends throughout the code. If a physician's failed surgery resulted in the death of an awilum, the surgeon's hands were cut off. If the same mistake killed a mushkanum's slave, the surgeon merely had to provide a replacement slave of equal value, saying 219, with the implication being that the penalty for killing the mushkanum himself would also be financial, not corporal. Their liabilities were similarly scaled down. If a mushkanum struck another mushkanum in a brawl, the penalty was a fine of 10 shekels of silver, section 204, a significantly smaller sum than if the altercation had involved patricians. This legal calculus suggests that the state viewed the mushkanum primarily through an economic lens. They were the engine of the empire's agricultural and industrial production. The tenant farmers, the state-employed artisans, the foot soldiers, and the law was designed to keep this engine running with minimal disruption. Financial penalties, unlike blood feuds or corporal punishments, allowed a productive member of society to settle his debt and return to work. Yet, it would be a mistake to view the mushkanum as entirely without state protection. The code afforded them significant rights in areas crucial to their economic survival. Their tenure of land, even if rented from the state or a temple, was protected by law. They could enter into legally binding contracts, borrow money, and own their own property, including slaves. The laws concerning theft of a mushkanum's property, while resulting in a smaller fine for the thief than if the victim were the palace, still prescribed a 10-fold restitution, a severe penalty designed to deter property crime and maintain economic stability. In family matters, the mushkanum household was recognized and protected. A mushkanum's wife had defined rights to her dowry, and his children were his legitimate heirs. The law, in essence, guaranteed the mushkanum a stable and predictable existence, not out of a commitment to equality, but out of a pragmatic recognition that the prosperity and order of the empire depended on the well-being of its vast commoner class. At the absolute bottom of Hammurabi's social and legal structure was the wardum, the slave. The code's primary concern regarding this class was the unambiguous definition and ruthless protection of their status as chattel property. A slave was an asset, a tool, a piece of living property, and the law was first and foremost an instrument to secure the master's investment. This is made explicit in the physical marking of the slave. Many were branded or tattooed with the name of their owner, a permanent mark of ownership. The state's role in enforcing this property right was absolute and brutal. Law Sivdin dictates that any person who helps a male or female slave of the palace or of a commoner to escape the city gates shall be put to death. Law 16 is equally severe. If a man harbours a fugitive slave in his house and does not bring him out at the public proclamation of the herald, that householder shall be put to death. There was no room for mercy or civil disobedience. The integrity of the slave system was a paramount concern of the state. The economic valuation of the slave's body is a consistent theme. When a slave was injured by a third party, the legal remedy was not for the slave, but for the master. If a surgeon's negligence killed a slave, the surgeon simply had to replace him with another slave of equal value. Section 219. If an ox gored a slave to death in the street, the owner of the ox had to pay a fixed fine to the slave's master. 251. The slave's life and physical well-being were line items in an economic ledger, their value calculated in shekels of silver, payable to the owner for his loss of property. This complete objectification represents the core of the slave's legal identity in Hammurabi's Babylon. Yet, woven into this harsh legal fabric is a surprising and complex thread of recognized personhood, a set of provisions that distinguishes Babylonian slavery from the absolute chattel systems of later history. The code acknowledges that a wardum was not merely an object, but a human being capable of entering into legally recognized social contracts. The most remarkable of these are the laws concerning marriage. Law Scone 175 explicitly allows a male slave to marry a free woman a whilom. In such a case, the master had no claim on the free wife, and critically, any children born of this union were born free. If the free wife brought a dowry into the marriage, it was legally protected for her children upon her husband's death. This was a revolutionary concept, providing a formal, state-sanctioned pathway for the children of slaves to be born into freedom, a mechanism that prevented the slave class from becoming a permanently closed and self-perpetuating caste. Furthermore, the code recognized a slave's ability to conduct business and accumulate his own assets, which could potentially be used to purchase his own freedom from his master. This dual status as an object of absolute ownership on one hand, and as a legal person with the capacity for marriage and property on the other, reveals the pragmatic and deeply complex nature of slavery in Hammurabi's empire. The promulgation of a unified law code was meaningless without a state apparatus to enforce it. Hammurabi's reforms extended to the very structure of the judicial system, creating a hierarchy of courts designed to implement his royally mandated justice. In Babylonian society, justice was a public affair. There were no dedicated courthouses. Instead, legal proceedings were typically convened in the open space near the city gate or within the courtyards of the main temple. This ensured transparency and made the administration of law a visible part of civic life. At the local level, justice was often administered by a council of elders, a traditional assembly of the city's leading citizens who would hear disputes and render judgments based on their knowledge of local custom and, now, the king's new code. For more serious or complex cases, however, the empire relied on a cadre of professional, royally appointed judges. These officials, often working in panels, were the king's direct representatives, and their primary duty was the faithful application of the laws inscribed on the Great Stele. The judicial process was methodical and evidence-based. A plaintiff would bring a case, and both parties would be required to present their evidence. In a highly literate and contract-based society, the most valued evidence was the written clay tablet, a sealed contract, a loan record, or a deed of sale. In the absence of such documents, witness testimony was crucial. Witnesses were required to swear a solemn oath in the name of the gods before testifying, a sacred act that invoked divine punishment for perjury. The code took the integrity of this process with the utmost seriousness. Its very first two laws are dedicated to punishing false accusation and the capital crime of bearing false witness in a capital case. Law Circ 5 goes even further, stating that a judge who alters his written judgment after the fact shall be removed from his position permanently and pay a 12-fold fine. Yet, Babylonian jurisprudence recognized that human evidence was not always sufficient to determine the truth. For certain crimes where proof was impossible to obtain, most notably accusations of sorcery or a wife's suspected adultery without witnesses, the system resorted to its ultimate arbiter, the river ordeal. This was not a trial by evidence, but a direct appeal to divine judgment. The accused was taken to the banks of the Euphrates, the divine river, and cast into the water. The outcome was interpreted as a direct verdict from the river god. If the accused sank, they were deemed guilty, and the river itself had executed the sentence. If they floated, they were declared innocent, and their accuser was often put to death for having brought a false charge. 2. This was not a test of swimming ability, but a sacred ritual, a final, terrifying mechanism for resolving the irresolvable, in which the state surrendered the burden of judgment to the gods themselves. Nowhere is the pragmatic and economic nature of Hammurabi's code more evident than in its extensive section on family law. In 18th century Babylon, marriage was not a romantic union, but a carefully negotiated civil contract, the primary purpose of which was to ensure the orderly transfer of property and the production of legitimate heirs. The entire legal framework surrounding the family was designed to protect the integrity of this contractual relationship. The foundation of any valid marriage was the kiristu, the sealed clay tablet that recorded the terms of the union. Law Scone 128 is unequivocal. If an Awylum has taken a wife, but has not drawn up a contract for her, that woman is not a wife. Without this written document, the relationship had no legal standing, and any children produced were not legitimate heirs. The marriage contract was fundamentally a financial agreement between two families. The groom's family paid a bride price, the tahatum, to the bride's father. This was not a purchase of the woman, but a form of compensation to her family for the loss of her labor and fertility. In return, the bride brought with her a dowry, the sherictum, provided by her father. This was a crucial economic asset, consisting of money, land, slaves, or household goods. The dowry was not a gift to the husband, it was the wife's inalienable property. While her husband could manage and use the assets during the marriage, he could not sell them. The dowry served as her lifelong economic security. Divorce was a recognized and regulated institution, though the process was far from equal. A husband could divorce his wife with relative ease, but it came at a significant financial cost. If his wife had borne him children, he was required to return her entire dowry and give her the use of a portion of his field, garden, and goods so that she could raise their children. Once the children were grown, she received a share of the inheritance equal to that of a single son. If the wife was childless, the husband still had to return her full dowry and pay her an additional settlement fee equal to the original bride price. These provisions were a powerful disincentive to casual divorce, ensuring that a man could not simply cast his wife aside without serious economic consequences. A woman's path to divorce was far more perilous. She could not simply declare her intent to leave. She had to bring a formal case against her husband, typically on grounds of cruelty or neglect. Law Scone 142 describes the process. If a woman hates her husband and has stated, "You may not have me," her case is investigated by the city authorities. If she is found to be blameless, and her husband is the one who has been going out and has greatly belittled her, she could take her dowry and return to her father's house, legally free. However, the risk was immense. If the investigation revealed that she was at fault, that she was a gadabout, has neglected her house, and has belittled her husband, the law was ruthless. They shall cast that woman into the water. The code, while offering women a path to escape abusive marriages, made it a life or death gamble, a stark reflection of the patriarchal order it was designed to uphold. The Babylonian family, as constructed by the laws of Hammurabi, was a rigid patriarchal institution, an economic and social unit under the absolute authority of its male head. The code's regulations were designed to protect the integrity and continuity of this household, with a particular focus on controlling female sexuality and ensuring the undisputed legitimacy of heirs. The honor of the household and the orderly transfer of its property were paramount, and the laws concerning adultery reflect this with uncompromising severity. A wife's fidelity was not a matter of personal morality, but a cornerstone of her husband's property rights. Law Scone 129, which condemns the adulterous wife and her partner to be bound and thrown into the water, treated the offense as a capital crime against the husband's authority and his exclusive rights to his wife's reproductive capacity. The only possibility of mercy lay with the husband himself, who could choose to pardon his wife, in which case the king would in turn pardon her male partner, a provision that reinforced the husband's ultimate power over his wife's life. The concern for maintaining clear bloodlines and social order extended to the strict prohibition of incest. The code outlines a series of forbidden relationships with punishments that varied according to the status of the individuals involved. The most severe penalties were reserved for incest that violated the core patriarchal line. Law Psalm 157 is explicit. If a man has intercourse with his own mother after his father's death, they shall burn both of them. A man who violated his daughter was to be exiled from the city. Psalm 154. These laws were not based on abstract moral taboos, but on the pragmatic need to prevent the catastrophic confusion of inheritance and social roles that such relationships would create. The ultimate purpose of this tightly regulated system was the orderly transmission of the family's estate. The laws of inheritance were detailed and precise, designed to preserve the patriarchal lineage. A man's property was to be divided equally among his legitimate sons. While daughters did not typically inherit a share of the estate directly, their economic future was secured through the dowry they received upon marriage. If a father failed to provide a dowry for his daughter, she was entitled to a share of his estate upon his death, equal to that of one son, but only for her lifetime, after which it would revert to her brothers. The father's authority, while immense, was not absolute. He could not disinherit a son capriciously. To do so, he had to bring a formal case before the city judges, proving that his son had committed a grave offense not once, but twice. Only after a second major transgression could the judges legally ratify the disinheritance. Sohn 168, 169. This judicial oversight was a crucial check on paternal power, ensuring that the continuity of the family line, a matter of state interest, was not jeopardized by a father's arbitrary whim. The stability of Hammurabi's empire rested not only on its military power and patriarchal households, but on a meticulously regulated economic system. Babylonian life was commercial life, and the code dedicates a vast portion of its text to the precise governance of transactions, ensuring a predictable and state-sanctioned environment for the flow of goods and capital. The bedrock of this entire system was the written contract. In a society where oral agreements were legally insufficient, every significant economic act, from the sale of a field to the loan of a few bushels of barley, had to be recorded on a sealed clay tablet, a tutappu. This document, bearing the impressions of the cylinder seals of the involved parties and witnesses, was the only legally recognized proof of a transaction. The code is filled with laws that begin with the assumption of such a document, demonstrating its ubiquity and essential nature in preventing disputes and fraud. Debt was a pervasive feature of this economy, and the code addresses it with a mixture of commercial pragmatism and state control. Loans were typically made in either silver or barley, and the state, in a remarkable act of early economic regulation, set the maximum legal interest rates. For silver loans, the rate was typically fixed at 20% per annum. For barley, a bulkier and more perishable commodity, it was 33.3%. These were not suggestions. Any creditor who charged a higher rate could be forced to forfeit the entire loan. The consequences for a debtor who could not repay were severe, but also regulated. Default could lead to debt servitude, where the debtor, his wife, or his children could be forced to work for the creditor. However, the code placed a firm limit on this practice. Law 117 stipulates that such servitude could last for a maximum of 3 years, after which the individuals were to be set free, a crucial provision that prevented the permanent enslavement of Babylonian citizens for commercial debt. The code also established a sophisticated legal framework for commercial ventures. It recognizes the role of the tamkarim, who was often a wealthy merchant or state-affiliated financier, and the shamalum, a traveling agent or junior partner who would take capital on a trading expedition. The laws carefully delineated the risks and responsibilities of this partnership. If the agent was robbed on his journey through no fault of his own, he could clear himself by a divine oath, and the loss fell upon the merchant. However, if the agent was found to be negligent or fraudulent, he was liable for repaying the merchant multiple times the value of the original capital. To further encourage and protect this vital long-distance trade, the code held the state itself accountable for the security of its highways. Law Sec 23 states that if a merchant is robbed within a certain district and the robber is not caught, the city and governor of that district must fully reimburse the merchant for his losses, a powerful state guarantee that made commerce a less perilous undertaking and bound the empire together in a web of shared economic interest. The same royal authority that regulated interest rates and commercial partnerships extended deep into the labor market of the empire. Hammurabi's code is, among its many functions, a detailed schedule of wages, a clear statement that the value of a man's work was not a matter for private negotiation, but a subject of state decree. This comprehensive system of price controls was designed to create economic predictability and to prevent disputes by establishing a clear, legally enforceable standard for compensation. The laws concerning labor reveal a society where a wide variety of professions were recognized, and their services quantified in precise measures of silver or grain. The construction industry, vital for the maintenance of cities and canals, was subject to particularly detailed regulation. The code specifies the daily wage for different types of builders and artisans. A skilled artisan, such as a brickmaker or a tailor, was to be paid 5 grains of silver per day. A builder received the same. 274. The state also set the rental price for the essential tools of the trade. The hire of a freight wagon, together with its driver and oxen, cost 180 QA of barley per day, Sec 271. The wages for boatmen were similarly standardized, varying by the size of the vessel they commanded, ensuring that the cost of transporting goods along the empire's vital waterways was stable and predictable. Agricultural labor, the foundation of the Babylonian economy, was also meticulously regulated. The code sets the annual wage for a field laborer at 8 gur of barley per year, while an ox driver received 6 gur, 257-258. The wages for herdsmen responsible for cattle or sheep were fixed at 8 gur of barley per year, 261. These laws did more than just set wages. They also defined liability. A herdsman who was negligent and allowed the number of animals in his care to decrease was required to make good the loss to the owner, according to the terms of his contract. This combination of a guaranteed wage with clearly defined professional responsibility was a hallmark of the code's approach to labor. The state's interest in the health of its agricultural economy is further demonstrated by the laws governing the hire of livestock. The daily rental fee for a threshing ox was 20 QA of barley. For a donkey, it was 10 QA, 268, 269. These were not just guidelines, they were the law. This system of state-mandated wages and fees permeated every level of the Babylonian economy. It was a legal framework designed to ensure fairness, as defined by the state, but more importantly, it was a tool for social and economic engineering. By setting the price of labor, Hammurabi's government could manage inflation, guarantee the profitability of state projects, and reinforce the economic stability upon which the entire imperial edifice was built. The entire edifice of Hammurabi's empire was built on a foundation of irrigated barley and wheat. Consequently, the code dedicates a significant and highly detailed section to the regulation of agriculture, revealing the state's profound and intrusive interest in every aspect of food production. These were not laws for gentlemen farmers, they were the hard-nosed regulations for a hydraulic society where a single act of negligence could have catastrophic consequences for the community. The central focus of this legal framework was the management of water. The complex network of canals and dikes that crisscrossed the Mesopotamian plain was the kingdom's circulatory system, and its maintenance was a matter of communal survival and therefore of state law. The code placed the burden of maintaining this system squarely on the shoulders of the individuals who benefited from it. Law Suk 53 is a stark illustration of this principle. If a man was too lazy to strengthen the dike of his own field, and a breach occurred, causing a flood that inundated his neighbor's land, the negligent man was to be sold into slavery, and his property sold to pay for the grain he had caused to be lost. If he could not cover the costs, the community was to divide the loss among themselves. This provision did more than just punish negligence. It legally bound the community together, making every farmer responsible for his neighbor's prosperity. The unauthorized use of water was treated with equal seriousness. A farmer who illegally opened his irrigation ditch to water his field and caused damage to the adjacent land had to repay the owner for the lost crops, 6556. Water was a shared, state-managed resource, and its use was a privilege governed by strict rules. Beyond the canals, the code meticulously regulated the relationship between landowners and the tenant farmers who worked the land. Tenancy was the dominant mode of agricultural production, and the laws sought to ensure that all arable land remained productive. The standard rental agreement was a share of the harvest, typically 1/2 or 1/3, paid to the landowner. However, the state would not tolerate a tenant who let a field lie fallow. Law Sec. 42 stipulates that if a man rented a field but did not cultivate it, he was still required to pay the owner a quantity of grain equal to the yield of a neighbouring cultivated field. If he had failed to even till the land, he had to plough and sow it before returning it to the owner. Section 43. This was a clear state mandate against unproductive land use. This principle of ensuring productivity extended to the management of livestock. The code recognized the potential for conflict between farmers and herdsmen. Law C-57 addresses the case of a shepherd who allows his flock to graze on a cultivated field without the owner's permission after the harvest has been brought in and the fields are open. The shepherd was required to compensate the farmer with a substantial amount of grain per unit of land. These were the laws of a state obsessed with maximizing its agricultural base. Every canal, every field, and every flock was a component of the kingdom's power, and Hammurabi's code was the legal machine designed to ensure every component functioned with maximum efficiency and minimal disruption. In the highly specialized urban society of Babylon, the state's interest in professional accountability extended to one of the most high-stakes professions of all, medicine. The practice of surgery in particular was not left to private ethics or professional guilds. It was subject to the direct and brutal oversight of the king's law. The code's section on medical liability is a remarkable and terrifying piece of early professional regulation, establishing a system where a surgeon's success was rewarded by the state, but his failure was punished with horrific corporal mutilation. This was a legal mechanism designed to ensure that those who practiced medicine, especially on the elite, did so with the utmost skill and caution. The laws make a sharp distinction based on the tool of the trade and the status of the patient. The most severe regulations concern the asu, the physician or surgeon, who performs a major operation on an awilum using a bronze lancet. The bronze lancet was the primary surgical instrument of the age, used for everything from lancing boils to delicate eye surgery. Law Stu 118 lays out the consequences of failure with chilling precision. If a physician has performed a major operation on an awilum with a bronze lancet and has caused the awilum's death, or has opened up the eye socket of an awilum with a bronze lancet and has destroyed the awilum's eye, they shall cut off his hands. This was the ultimate professional penalty, a punishment that not only ended a surgeon's career permanently, but also marked him for life as a failed practitioner. The symmetry is stark. The hands that wielded the blade and failed were to be removed. Conversely, success in treating the elite was a matter for state-mandated reward. Law 215 stipulates that if a physician saved the life of an awilum or healed his eye, the patient was required to pay the surgeon 10 shekels of silver. This was a considerable sum, equal to the fine for striking another patrician in a brawl, and it established a clear financial incentive for undertaking risky but necessary procedures on the powerful. As with all other aspects of the code, this high-stakes system of liability and reward was stratified by class. The penalties for failure and the rewards for success were dramatically reduced when the patient was not a patrician. If a surgeon's failed operation caused the death of a slave, he was not mutilated. He simply had to render slave for slave, providing the owner with a healthy replacement of equal value. Dachu 119. If he healed a slave's broken bone, his fee was a mere 2 shekels of silver, paid to the slave's master, not the slave. 223. The surgeon's hands were only at risk when the life and body of a member of the elite were on the line. This was not a system designed to protect all patients equally. It was a legal instrument to guarantee the highest possible standard of care for the powerful, using the surgeon's own body as collateral. After the final law is stated, the Steles text transitions into a lengthy and powerful epilogue. This concluding section serves a dual purpose. It is both a final, triumphant declaration of Hammurabi's achievements as a lawgiver and a terrifying series of divine curses intended to protect his monument and its legal principles for all time. The tone shifts back to the high literary style of the prologue, as Hammurabi speaks directly to future generations, framing his work as the culmination of his divinely ordained reign. He presents himself as the perfect king, the shepherd of the people, who has brought peace, prosperity, and above all, justice to his land. He declares that he has inscribed his precious words on the stelae so that the strong might not oppress the weak, and to give justice to the orphan and the widow. The epilogue then makes the monument's intended function explicit. Hammurabi invites any citizen who feels he has been wronged to come and stand before the stelae, which he calls my image as a righteous king, and have the laws read aloud to him. By hearing the inscribed words, the wronged man will understand his case, and his heart will be glad. This is a remarkable statement, a clear articulation of the principle of public, accessible law. The stele is presented as the ultimate legal recourse, a direct channel to the king's justice, available to every subject in the land. It is Hammurabi's final testament to his role as the supreme judge, a legacy he intended to be both permanent and personal. To ensure this permanence, the epilogue unleashes a torrent of horrific curses upon any future ruler who would dare to alter, deface, or disregard his laws. This section is a masterpiece of psychological warfare, invoking the full and terrible power of the Mesopotamian pantheon. Hammurabi calls upon the greatest gods, one by one, to inflict specific and devastating punishments. He asks the great god Anu to shatter the offender's scepter and curse his destiny. He implores Enlil, the Lord of Command, to stir up an unrelenting rebellion against him. He calls upon Shamash, the great judge of heaven and earth, to overthrow his kingship and deny him justice. The goddess Ishtar is asked to bring him defeat in battle and turn his men against him. Adad, the storm god, is summoned to bring famine and flood to his land. The list continues, a litany of divine retribution that targets every aspect of a king's power and well-being: his health, his family, his army, his people, and his very soul in the afterlife. These were not idle threats. In the Mesopotamian worldview, such a powerful, royally inscribed curse was believed to have a real and inescapable effect. It was the ultimate magical and theological defense, the final, terrifying seal designed to ensure that Hammurabi's justice would, quite literally, be set in stone forever. The divine curses inscribed on the great stele, intended to guarantee the eternal stability of Hammurabi's creation, proved powerless against the inexorable forces of history. While the empire he forged remained a dominant power for a time, its foundations began to erode shortly after his death. His son and successor, Samsu-iluna, inherited a vast but restive kingdom, and his long reign was marked by a series of desperate, ultimately futile, struggles to hold it together. The first major challenge came from the south, the ancient Sumerian heartland, where a rebellion coalesced into a new independent state known as the Sealand dynasty, severing the empire's connection to the Persian Gulf. Simultaneously, new peoples began to press upon the empire's frontiers. From the Zagros Mountains to the east, Kassite tribes initiated a slow but steady migration into Babylonian territory, sometimes as mercenaries, sometimes as settlers, gradually altering the demographic and political landscape. The empire that Hammurabi had built through swift conquest began a slow, painful process of contraction. Under Samsu-iluna and his successors, the great cities of the south Larsa, Isin were lost, one by one, to the Sealand kings. The Babylonian kingdom shrank back to its original core, the northern region of Akkad, becoming once again a regional power rather than an imperial hegemon. The dynasty weakened, its treasury depleted by constant warfare, and its authority diminished. The final, catastrophic blow came not from a neighboring Mesopotamian power, but from a distant and unexpected direction. Around 1595 BCE, the Hittite king Mursili I, from his capital high on the Anatolian plateau, launched one of the most audacious military raids in ancient history. The Hittite army marched hundreds of miles down the Euphrates, a lightning campaign that seems to have caught the Babylonians completely by surprise. This was not a war of conquest. The Hittites had no intention of occupying a territory so far from their homeland. It was a raid for plunder and prestige, a devastating demonstration of Hittite military power. They reached the gates of Babylon, sacked the great city, and plundered the temple of Marduk, carrying off its sacred cult statue. The historical records are sparse, but the archaeological evidence points to a massive destruction. The first dynasty of Babylon, which had ruled for 3 centuries, collapsed in the immediate aftermath of this raid. The Hittites retreated as quickly as they had come, leaving behind a political vacuum. Into this void stepped the Kassites, who seized control of the leaderless city and established a new dynasty that would rule Babylonia for over 400 years. The empire of Hammurabi was gone, and his great capital was now in the hands of foreign kings. His laws were no longer the supreme law of a unified land, but the legacy of a fallen dynasty, its principles now subject to the interpretations and needs of new rulers. For centuries after the Hittite sack of Babylon, the great stele of Hammurabi likely remained in its place of honor, a revered monument even under the long rule of the Kassite kings. While Hammurabi's dynasty was gone, his laws continued to be studied in scribal schools, and his monument stood as a symbol of a golden age of Mesopotamian justice and power. Its fate, however, was to be determined by the shifting balance of power in the wider Near East. By the middle of the 12th century BCE, the Kassite dynasty was in a state of terminal decline, weakened by internal strife and the rising power of Assyria in the north. This weakness presented an opportunity for Babylonia's ancient and formidable eastern neighbor, Elam. From their capital at Susa, in the lowlands of modern-day Iran, a new and aggressive Elamite dynasty emerged, eager to project its power into the Mesopotamian heartland. Around 1158 BCE, the Elamite king Shutruk-Nahunte launched a massive and devastating invasion of Babylonia. This was not a mere border raid, it was a campaign of conquest and cultural plunder on an unprecedented scale. Shutruk-Nahunte and his sons swept through the Babylonian cities, sacking the ancient cult centers of Akkad, Sippar, and Babylon itself. The primary goal of this invasion, beyond simple economic enrichment, was the systematic appropriation of Mesopotamia's cultural and religious heritage. In the ideology of ancient Near Eastern warfare, victory was proven not just by defeating an enemy's army, but by capturing its gods and its most sacred symbols of power. The Elamites carried off the cult statues of major deities, an act that was believed to render the defeated cities spiritually powerless. Among the treasures they targeted was Hammurabi's great diorite stele. This was no ordinary piece of loot. It was one of the most famous monuments in the entire region, a potent symbol of Mesopotamian royal authority and legal tradition. To the Elamites, capturing it was the ultimate act of triumph. It was a physical and ideological victory, a demonstration that the power of the Elamite king and his god in Shushinak had superseded that of Marduk and his most famous royal servant. The logistical effort of transporting the multi-ton stele from its location, likely Sippar, the city of the sun god Shamash, to Susa was immense. The monument was carefully removed from its pedestal and hauled hundreds of kilometers over land and river, a journey that was itself a triumphal procession. Once it arrived in Susa, the stele was erected in the temple complex as a war trophy, a testament to Shutruk-Nahunte's victory. In a final, supreme act of conquest, the Elamite king had his own artisans erase a section of the original inscription 35 of Hammurabi's laws to clear a space for his own dedicatory text, though for reasons unknown, it was never completed. This act of deliberate erasure was the ultimate symbol of subjugation, overwriting the law of the conquered with the name of the conqueror. The Stele of Hammurabi, a monument created as a public beacon of justice for the people of Mesopotamia, was now a spoil of war in a foreign capital, its original purpose subverted, beginning a long silence that would last for 3,000 years. Installed as a spoil of war on the Acropolis of Susa, the Stele of Hammurabi entered a new phase of its existence. It was no longer a legal document to be consulted, but a political statement, a silent testament to Elamite military might. For a time it stood among other plundered Mesopotamian treasures, its intricate cuneiform a reminder of a conquered civilization. The Elamite kingdom, however, was not immune to the violent political currents of the ancient Near East. The balance of power was shifting once again, this time irrevocably. In northern Mesopotamia, the Neo-Assyrian state was coalescing into a ruthless and highly efficient military empire, an expansionist power with an insatiable appetite for conquest. The inevitable collision between Assyria and Elam became the defining conflict of the 7th century BCE. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a ruler known for both his scholarly pursuits and his extreme brutality, became obsessed with the complete subjugation of his Elamite rivals. After a series of campaigns that weakened the Elamite state, Ashurbanipal launched a final cataclysmic invasion around 647 BCE. His goal was not merely to defeat Elam, but to erase it from history. The Assyrian army marched on Susa, and the sack that followed was one of the most thorough and vicious acts of destruction in the ancient world, an event Ashurbanipal himself recorded with chilling pride in his royal annals. The Assyrian soldiers were given license to destroy everything. They systematically dismantled the city's temples, pulling down the great ziggurat and smashing its horned towers. They entered the sacred tombs of the Elamite kings, desecrating their remains and exposing their bones to the sun. The city was put to the torch, and its palaces and administrative buildings were razed to the ground. In this maelstrom of state-sponsored destruction, the great monuments displayed on the Acropolis were toppled. The Stele of Hammurabi, a dense, 7-foot column of solid diorite, was too massive to be easily destroyed or carried away by the rampaging Assyrian army. Instead, it fell amidst the collapsing walls and burning debris of the temple complex that had been its prison. The silence began then. As the fires of Susa died down, the ruins of the once great capital were left to the elements. Over the succeeding decades and centuries, layers of wind-blown sand and earth began to accumulate over the rubble. The site was eventually reoccupied, most notably by the Achaemenid Persians who built a grand palace for Darius the Great nearby. But the old Elamite Acropolis remained a mound of ruins, a tell of forgotten history. The stele lay buried deep within this mound, its surface protected from the elements, its existence completely forgotten by the world above. The empires of the Persians, the Greeks of Alexander the Great, the Parthians, and the Sasanians rose and fell, their histories unfolding directly on top of the buried monument. The laws of Hammurabi, the memory of his empire, and the very stone upon which they were inscribed had vanished from human memory, awaiting a future age of discovery. While the great diorite stele lay toppled and forgotten beneath the accumulating ruins of Susa, the words inscribed upon it were embarking on a completely different journey of survival. The long silence of the stone monument was not the end of Hammurabi's law, because the code's primary mode of transmission was never the stele itself. Its true vessel of permanence was the humble, ubiquitous, and remarkably durable clay tablet. The laws of Hammurabi survived not as a single monument, but as a canonical text, a foundational element of the Mesopotamian educational curriculum that was copied and studied by generations of scribes for more than 1,000 years after its creation. This survival was a direct consequence of the Adaba, the scribal school or tablet house, the institution responsible for training the literate bureaucracy that ran the ancient Near East. A young boy destined for a career as a scribe, priest, or administrator would begin a long and arduous education centered on the mastery of cuneiform. The curriculum was highly standardized, beginning with the basics of impressing a stylus into clay to form simple signs, and progressing through the memorization of vast lexical lists of signs, words, and grammatical forms. The final stage of this education involved the copying of great literary and scholarly works, the classics of Mesopotamian civilization. Alongside the Epic of Gilgamesh and the creation epic Enuma Elish, the Code of Hammurabi became a set text. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of fragmentary copies of the code from sites all across Mesopotamia, most notably from the scribal quarters of Nippur, Sippar, and even the distant Assyrian capital of Nineveh. These are not monumental inscriptions, but school texts. They take various forms: small lentil-shaped tablets containing a single law, used for dictation exercises, larger rectangular tablets with excerpts from different sections, and occasionally multi-tablet series attempting to replicate a significant portion of the text. Many of these copies are riddled with the errors of student scribes, providing a fascinating glimpse into the pedagogical process. The purpose of this endless copying was not primarily legal. The specific laws of Hammurabi, tied to the economic and social realities of the 18th century BCE, were largely obsolete within a few generations. Instead, the code was studied as a model of perfect Akkadian prose, a masterclass in legal formulation, and a symbol of a glorious, unified past. It taught scribes the precise, casuistic language needed to draft contracts and legal documents. It served as a historical document, a testament to the achievements of a legendary king. This continuous scribal tradition, this unbroken chain of teachers and students copying the text for educational and cultural purposes, is what truly ensured the law's survival. While the Elamites could carry off the stone, they could not capture the knowledge that had been baked into countless clay tablets and disseminated throughout the intellectual centers of the ancient world. The enduring legacy of Hammurabi's code was not confined to the classrooms of Babylonian scribes. Its influence radiated throughout the ancient Near East, becoming a foundational model for all subsequent legal thought. The civilizations that rose and fell in the centuries after Hammurabi's reign did not exist in a vacuum. They were part of a shared Mesopotamian cultural and intellectual world, and when their kings sought to create their own legal monuments, they inevitably looked to the most famous and comprehensive example available. This influence is not one of simple imitation, but of active engagement, a legal dialogue across centuries where later societies adopted Hammurabi's structure while consciously altering its content to reflect their own distinct values. The Hittite Law Code, compiled in Anatolia several centuries after Hammurabi, is a prime example of this dynamic. The Hittite scribes were clearly familiar with the Mesopotamian legal tradition. Their laws are written in the same casuistic if-then format, a direct inheritance from Babylonian jurisprudence. Yet, the spirit of Hittite law is profoundly different. Where Hammurabi's code is famous for its use of lex talionis, the Hittite code almost entirely rejects it. There is no eye for an eye in Hittite law. Instead, it is overwhelmingly compensatory, reverting to the older Sumerian principle of fines and restitution. For instance, where Hammurabi would demand a broken bone for a broken bone, the Hittite laws prescribe a fixed silver payment that varies according to the severity of the injury. Even for homicide, the death penalty is rare, typically reserved for offences against the king or the state. The murder of a commoner was settled with a large payment of silver to the victim's family. This represents a conscious legal and philosophical choice, a decision to prioritize social and economic restoration over physical retribution. In stark contrast are the Middle Assyrian laws, dating from around 1100 BCE. These laws, discovered at the ancient capital of Ashur, also follow the casuistic formula, but their content is marked by a severity that makes Hammurabi's code seem almost lenient. The Assyrian laws are particularly notable for their brutal and obsessive focus on controlling the lives of women. The penalties for social and sexual transgressions are horrific. A woman who has a miscarriage, whether intentionally or not, could be impaled on a stake. A wife who steals from her husband could have her ears cut off by him. The laws mandate the veiling of respectable married women in public, while explicitly forbidding prostitutes from doing so, making a woman's social status and sexual availability a matter of state-enforced public display. This legal framework reflects the values of a militaristic and deeply patriarchal society, where the state's interest in controlling property, bloodlines, and female autonomy was expressed with a level of punitive violence far exceeding that of the Babylonians. Together, these later codes demonstrate Hammurabi's true influence. He had established the definitive format for monumental law, creating a standard against which all future kings would measure their own justice, whether they chose to moderate, intensify, or reject his principles. The discovery and translation of Hammurabi's code in the early 20th century sent a profound shockwave, not through the field of Assyriology alone, but through the very heart of biblical scholarship. The initial reaction was one of sensationalism and controversy, encapsulated in the Pan-Babylonianism movement, which argued that the core tenets of the Hebrew Bible were little more than borrowings from a superior Mesopotamian civilization. While this extreme view has long been discredited, the undeniable parallels between the laws of Hammurabi and the legal corpora of the Old Testament reveal a deep and shared legal heritage that permeated the entire ancient Near East. The relationship is not one of direct copying, but of a common ancestry, a legal language spoken from the Euphrates to the Jordan. The most immediate and striking similarity lies in the casuistic formulation. The Covenant Code, found in the Book of Exodus, chapters 21 through 23, is structured in the same conditional if-then format that defines Hammurabi's laws. This shared legal syntax is a clear indication that the Hebrew scribes who compiled these texts were working within a well-established and ancient scribal tradition that had its roots in Mesopotamia. They were using the standard intellectual tools of their time to record their own legal principles. The parallels extend to the content of specific laws, often with startling verbal echoes. The principle of lex talionis is the most famous example. Hammurabi's eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth is mirrored almost precisely in Exodus 21:24. Another remarkable parallel is the case of the goring ox. Hammurabi's laws, 250-252, make a careful distinction. If an ox, not previously known to be dangerous, gores and kills a man, the owner is not held liable beyond the death of the ox. However, if the owner had been officially warned that his ox was a gorer and failed to keep it confined, he was required to pay a substantial fine. The Covenant Code in Exodus 21:28-32 presents an almost identical legal logic. If an ox gores a person to death, the ox is stoned, but the owner is not liable. But if the owner knew the ox was dangerous and did not restrain it, both the ox and the owner were to be put to death, a sentence that could be commuted through the payment of a ransom. The shared details the distinction between a known and unknown danger, and the concept of owner liability are too specific to be coincidental. However, the differences are as illuminating as the similarities. Biblical law, while using the Mesopotamian framework, infuses it with a profoundly different theological and social ideology. Hammurabi's justice is explicitly stratified by class. The penalty for injuring a commoner or a slave is a fixed monetary fine. The Covenant Code, while not a modern egalitarian document, largely eliminates this class-based system of penalties. The life of any free Israelite is considered of equal value before the law. Furthermore, the entire legal system is embedded within the context of a covenant between the people and a single, transcendent God. The laws are not presented as the wise edicts of a great king, but as divine commands, inseparable from moral and ritual obligations. The repeated and emphatic concern for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger as a core religious duty gives biblical law a distinct ethical tenor. The Hebrew scribes were not plagiarists. They were participants in an ancient legal conversation, using its familiar language to articulate a new and revolutionary vision of divine justice. The obliteration of Susa by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the mid-7th century BCE was a geopolitical event, but its more lasting consequence was geological. A great city was transformed into a ruin, and that ruin in turn began its slow transformation into a feature of the landscape. While the Achaemenid Persian kings, most notably Darius I, would later build a magnificent new palace complex at Susa, they did so adjacent to the old Elamite Acropolis, not directly on top of its most devastated sections. The mound containing the plundered Mesopotamian treasures including the toppled stele of Hammurabi, was largely abandoned, becoming a quarry for building materials and a testament to a vanquished past. With the fall of the Persian Empire to Alexander the Great, Susa entered the Hellenistic world, renamed Seleucia on the Euleus, but its political and economic importance began to wane as new trade routes and administrative centers rose to prominence. Over the subsequent centuries, the region passed from the control of the Seleucids to the Parthians and then to the Sasanians. Each empire left its mark, but the memory of the ancient pre-Persian Elamite capital grew ever more distant. For the local populations, the sprawling complex of mounds became known simply as Shush, a place associated with biblical figures like Daniel and Esther, but its deeper history was lost. The physical process of forgetting was relentless. The crumbling mud brick walls of the Elamite city, exposed to the elements, dissolved under the infrequent but intense seasonal rains. Wind blowing from the plains of Khuzestan deposited fine layers of silt and sand over the ruins, a slow but inexorable burial. Vegetation took root, its decay adding to the accumulating layers of soil. The site became a series of tells, large artificial hills composed of the compressed debris of millennia of human occupation. The Elamite Acropolis, the highest of these mounds, now concealed its secrets, including the diorite stele under a thick mantle of earth. The monument lay dozens of feet below the surface, its existence unsuspected. To the travelers and geographers of the Roman and early Islamic periods, Susa was a name on a map, a minor town near a series of impressive but inscrutable mounds. Its true identity as one of the world's oldest and most powerful cities was a forgotten fact. The legal pronouncements of Hammurabi, the pronouncements of Shutruk-Nahunte, and the victory annals of Ashurbanipal were all equally silent, entombed together in the stratified earth of a city whose history had been erased by conquest and sealed by the sands of time. The long silence of the tells at Susa was finally broken in the 19th century, a consequence of the great European powers' burgeoning interest in the ancient Near East. This fascination was initially fueled not by a scientific desire to understand Elamite or Mesopotamian history, but by two powerful contemporary forces: the quest to corroborate the historical narratives of the Old Testament, and the intense geopolitical rivalry between Britain and France for influence in the Persian Qajar Empire. Early European visitors to the region were often diplomats, military officers, or adventurers, not trained archaeologists. Their excavations were frequently little more than treasure hunting expeditions, focused on acquiring impressive artifacts to ship back to the museums of London and Paris. Men like William Loftus, a British geologist, conducted some of the first digs at Susa in the 1850s, correctly identifying the site as the biblical Shushan and unearthing glazed brick panels from the Achaemenid palace. But his methods were crude, and his primary goal was the acquisition of museum-worthy objects. A more systematic approach became possible only after the monumental intellectual achievement of the mid-19th century, the decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform by Henry Rawlinson and others. This breakthrough, using trilingual inscriptions from sites like Behistun, provided a historical key, allowing scholars to read the texts of the Achaemenid kings and, by extension, to begin unlocking the older and more complex scripts of Elamite and Akkadian. With this new tool, the mounds of Persia were no longer just inscrutable ruins. They were historical archives waiting to be read. The defining moment for the future of Susa came not from a discovery in the field, but from a diplomatic coup in the court of the Shah. In 1897, the French government, leveraging its significant political and economic influence, secured a remarkable agreement with the Qajar monarchy. This monopole, or monopoly, granted France the exclusive and perpetual right to conduct all archaeological excavations throughout the entire territory of Persia. In exchange, the Persian government would receive a share of any gold or silver discovered, but all other antiquities, regardless of their material or historical significance, were to become the property of France. This unprecedented agreement effectively turned the historical heritage of an entire nation into a French archaeological concession. To professionalize this undertaking, the French government established the Délégation en Perse, a formal scientific mission tasked with the systematic exploration of Persian antiquity. Susa, with its immense size and historical importance, was chosen as the primary focus of the delegation's work, setting the stage for the discoveries that would soon emerge from its long silent mounds. The man entrusted with the leadership of the French Délégation en Perse was Jacques de Morgan, a figure who embodied the transitional state of archaeology at the turn of the 20th century. He was not a philologist or an art historian, but a mining engineer by training, a background that profoundly shaped his archaeological methods. De Morgan approached the tells of Susa not as delicate, stratified historical records to be carefully dissected, but as geological formations to be systematically quarried. He brought an industrial scale to the practice of excavation, employing hundreds of local labourers and utilising mining techniques, including the use of railway lines and Decauville carts to haul away massive quantities of earth. His goal was the rapid discovery of significant artefacts and architectural features, a method that, while yielding spectacular results, often came at the cost of the detailed contextual information that modern archaeology prizes. De Morgan focused his efforts on the highest mound at Susa, the Acropolis, correctly identifying it as the location of the city's most important temples and monuments. It was here that he expected to find the oldest and most significant artifacts. During the excavation season of 1901-1902, his teams of workmen were digging a deep trench through the heart of the mound. In December and January, in a layer of earth corresponding to the Elamite period, their shovels struck something unyielding. It was not the usual mud brick or pottery, but a large, polished surface of immensely hard, dark stone. The workmen carefully cleared the surrounding earth, slowly revealing the contours of a massive, broken monument. The discovery did not come as a single, intact object. The great stele, toppled during the Assyrian sack over 2.5 millennia earlier, had fractured upon impact. The team unearthed 3 large, heavy fragments of diorite. When pieced together, they formed a near-complete column over 7 feet tall, its surface covered in the dense, precise markings of cuneiform script and crowned with the magnificent relief of a king before his god. The expedition's epigrapher, Father Vincent Shale, a Dominican priest and one of the leading Assyriologists of his day, immediately recognized the script as Old Babylonian Akkadian and the relief as a classic scene of divine investiture. Even before a full translation was possible, the scale, quality, and antiquity of the monument were obvious. De Morgan knew at once that he had found one of the most important artifacts in Mesopotamian history. The fragments were carefully packed into crates and, in accordance with the terms of the French monopoly, began the long journey from the plains of Persia to their new, permanent home in the Louvre Museum in Paris. The discovery of the 3 great fragments of diorite on the Susa Acropolis was not a single moment of revelation, but the beginning of an intensive on-site process of recovery and intellectual assessment. The pieces themselves were immense, the largest weighing well over a ton, their fracture lines sharp and clean, a clear record of the ancient impact that had broken the monument. The immediate task for Jacques de Morgan's team was the delicate and arduous process of fully excavating and raising these massive sections from the deep trench. This was a problem of engineering, requiring the construction of robust wooden scaffolding and the use of heavy-duty block and tackle systems, all operated by the sheer force of dozens of labourers. Each fragment had to be carefully undercut, supported, and then painstakingly lifted from the earth that had been its tomb for 25 centuries. As the pieces were brought to the surface and cleaned of the encrusted dirt, the true nature of the find became overwhelmingly clear to the expedition's epigrapher, Father Vincent Shale. His work began immediately, under the harsh Persian sun. He would have carefully washed the inscribed surfaces, using soft brushes to remove every grain of dirt from the thousands of meticulously carved cuneiform characters without damaging the stone. The sheer quantity of text was unlike any single inscription previously discovered from the Old Babylonian period. This was not a short royal dedication or a simple economic record. This was a document of monumental scope and complexity. Scheele began the painstaking process of making preliminary transcriptions and creating squeezes wet paper or cloth pressed against the surface to create a perfect negative impression of the text, which could then be studied more easily than the dark stone itself. As the three fragments were laid out side by side at the expedition's base camp, the original form of the stele could be reconstructed. The team could see how the vertical columns of text flowed across the breaks, allowing them to determine the original order of the pieces. The magnificent relief sculpture, now clearly visible, provided the first crucial clue to the monument's identity. The scene of a king receiving the symbols of justice from the sun god was a familiar trope, but the quality of the carving was exceptional. It was Father Scheele, working from his preliminary readings of the prologue, who made the definitive identification. He found the name of the king, Hammurabi, and the name of the god, Shamash, confirming that this was not just any royal monument, but a long-lost legal code from one of the most famous kings of ancient Babylon. The discovery was therefore twofold, not just of a magnificent object, but of a foundational text in the history of human law, found hundreds of kilometers from its home, a spoil of war, whose true significance was only just beginning to be understood. The definitive identification of the monument as Hammurabi's long-lost law code transformed the three massive fragments from mere artifacts into a treasure of global significance. Their journey from the excavation camp at Susa to the galleries of the Louvre in Paris was a major logistical operation, a testament to the reach and resources of the French state at the height of its colonial and scientific influence. The first challenge was to safely transport the multi-ton pieces of diorite from the remote archaeological site to the nearest navigable waterway. Each fragment was painstakingly encased in a custom-built wooden crate, padded with whatever materials were available to cushion it against the shocks of the journey. These immense crates were then loaded onto heavy-duty carts or sledges and hauled by teams of oxen and dozens of laborers across the rough terrain of the Khuzestan plain to the Karun River. From there, the crates were loaded onto barges for the slow journey downstream to the port of Muhammara, modern Khorramshahr, on the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which flows into the Persian Gulf. At the port, the crates were transferred from the river barges to the hold of a French steamship bound for Europe. This sea voyage would have taken several weeks, a period of great anxiety for the archaeologists, as the priceless and irreplaceable cargo was subject to the perils of the open ocean. The ship would have navigated the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and passed through the recently opened Suez Canal into the Mediterranean, a modern artery of empire that now carried the treasures of the ancient world back to its new capitals. Upon its arrival at the French port of Marseille, the cargo was transferred one last time, this time onto a specially chartered train for the final overland journey to Paris. The arrival of the stele at the Louvre in 1902 was a major event in the European academic world. It was received not by warehouse workers, but by a team of the museum's curators, conservators, and philologists. The immediate task was the monument's reconstruction. In the workshops of the museum, the three massive fragments were carefully cleaned and examined. The museum's skilled technicians then undertook the complex engineering challenge of reassembling them into a single, stable monument. A custom-designed pedestal and internal metal armature were created to support the immense weight and to join the fracture lines with near-perfect precision, restoring the stele to its original, imposing form for the first time in over 2.5 millennia. With the physical object now secure and reassembled, it was handed over to the intellectual care of Father Vincent Scheele. The stage was now set for the even more arduous journey of translation, the process that would finally break the monument's long silence and reveal the full scope of its legal contents to the modern world. With the physical monument of Hammurabi's law reassembled in the Louvre, the far greater intellectual challenge began. The task of translating the nearly 4,000 lines of Old Babylonian cuneiform fell to the expedition's epigrapher, Father Vincent Scheele. This was a Herculean undertaking, not because the script was unknown, but because of the sheer volume of the text and the profound scholarly expertise required to render it accurately. The field of Assyriology, though still young, had matured significantly since the initial decipherments of the mid-19th century. The foundational work of scholars like Henry Rawlinson had produced extensive sign lists, dictionaries, and grammatical analyses of the Akkadian language. Father Schiele, as one of the world's leading experts, was equipped with the intellectual tools necessary for the task, but the work still required immense, focused labor. The process was methodical and painstaking. Schiele would have worked not only from the stele itself, but from high-quality photographs and paper squeezes, which provided a more portable and easily legible copy of the text. The first step was transliteration, a meticulous, character-by-character rendering of the cuneiform signs into a Latin-based script. This was a highly technical process, as many cuneiform signs are polyvalent, meaning they can represent multiple different syllables or word concepts, depending on the context. Each sign had to be correctly identified, and its specific value determined based on the surrounding grammar and syntax. This initial phase alone represented a massive philological undertaking. Only after the transliteration was complete could the actual translation into French begin. This was more than a simple linguistic exercise. It was an act of deep historical and cultural interpretation. Schiele had to navigate the complex legal terminology of the 18th century BCE, a vocabulary that had fallen out of use for 3 millennia. He had to understand the precise legal and economic meanings of terms like terhatum, bride price, and sherictum, dowry, and the subtle but critical distinctions between the social classes of a whilom, mushkanum, and wardum. This required not just a knowledge of the Akkadian language, but a profound understanding of the entire social and economic structure of Old Babylonian society, knowledge gleaned from the thousands of administrative and economic tablets that had been translated over the previous decades. Working with astonishing speed, Father Schiele completed the entire task in less than a year. In 1902, he published the complete first edition of the text, including the cuneiform transcription, a full French translation, and a scholarly commentary, as the 4th volume of the official memoirs of the French delegation to Persia. This rapid publication was a monumental scholarly achievement, a testament to both Schiele's personal brilliance and the collective intellectual infrastructure that the young field of Assyriology had already built. The 3,000-year silence of the stele had been broken, and the laws of Hammurabi were once again available for the world to read. The publication of Father Schiele's translation in 1902 was not a quiet academic event. It detonated with the force of a bombshell in the intellectual and theological landscape of Europe. For the general public, and indeed for most scholars, the bedrock of ancient law was the law of Moses, the divine commandments delivered to the Israelites at Mount Sinai as recorded in the Old Testament. This was considered the foundational moment of human jurisprudence, a direct and unique revelation from God. The discovery of Hammurabi's code shattered this foundational myth. Here was a complete, sophisticated, and comprehensive legal system, inscribed in stone, that predated the time of Moses by at least 4 centuries. The implications were immediate and profound. The discovery poured fuel onto an already raging fire in Germany, known as the Babel und Bibel, Babylon and Bible, controversy. This fierce public debate had been ignited by a series of lectures by the prominent German Assyriologist Friedrich Delitzsch, delivered in the presence of the Kaiser himself. Delitzsch's central explosive argument was that the Hebrew Bible was not a unique work of divine inspiration, but was, in fact, heavily indebted to, and in many ways, a derivative of a much older and more advanced Babylonian civilization. The Code of Hammurabi became his Exhibit A. He pointed to the stunning parallels, the casuistic formulation, the principle of lex talionis, the specific regulations concerning matters like the goring ox, as undeniable proof that the Mosaic law was not a miraculous revelation, but a later, localized adaptation of a common Mesopotamian legal tradition. The reaction was immediate and furious. Theologians, church leaders, and the public at large were thrown into a tumultuous debate that played out in the pages of newspapers and popular journals. To suggest that the sacred law of the Bible had human, and specifically Babylonian, origins was seen by many as a direct assault on the very foundations of Judaism and Christianity. The controversy was not merely academic. It touched upon the core of Western identity and religious belief. Delitzsch was accused of undermining faith, and the debate took on a nationalist and sometimes anti-Semitic tone. While the most extreme claims of the pan-Babylonianist movement were eventually tempered by more sober scholarship, the damage to the old orthodoxy was permanent. The Code of Hammurabi had irrevocably demonstrated that the legal traditions of the Old Testament did not arise in a historical vacuum. They were part of a vast and ancient stream of jurisprudence that had flowed out of Mesopotamia for centuries. The discovery forced a new, more critical and historical understanding of the Bible, one that situated it within the complex cultural milieu of the ancient Near East. The global sensation was not simply that an ancient law code had been found. It was that the discovery had fundamentally and forever altered the modern world's relationship with its most sacred texts. After the initial theological and historical shockwaves subsided, a century of sober, intensive scholarship has led to a far more nuanced and complex understanding of Hammurabi's monument. The modern interpretation has moved decisively away from the initial view of the stele as a comprehensive statute book, a Babylonian equivalent of a modern legal code to be consulted by judges in their daily work. The most significant piece of evidence that undermined this older view was a conspicuous absence. In the vast archives of legal and administrative tablets from Hammurabi's reign and subsequent periods, there are virtually no court records that make any direct reference to the code. Judges appear to have continued to rule based on local custom, contractual agreements, and their own discretion, not by citing the numbered laws of the Great Stele. This has led to a new consensus that the monument's function was not primarily legislative in a practical day-to-day sense. One major school of thought views the code as a masterpiece of Mesopotamian science, a scholarly treatise on jurisprudence. In this interpretation, the collection of laws was a systematic, academic compilation of legal principles and precedents created by the king's scribes as a demonstration of their intellectual mastery. Its purpose was to serve as an advanced textbook for the training of future scribes, teaching them the casuistic formula and providing them with a canonical set of ideal judgments. The laws were not intended to be binding statutes, but rather exemplary cases, a scientific classification of justice that brought order to the chaotic world of human disputes. Building on this, the dominant modern interpretation sees the stele, above all, as a work of royal apologia, a profound piece of political propaganda. In this view, the monument is not a law code at all, but a monument celebrating Hammurabi as the perfect king of justice. The lengthy prologue and epilogue, which frame the laws, are the key. They present the king as the divinely chosen shepherd, the bringer of order, and the protector of the weak. The laws themselves are the proof of this claim. They are a curated selection of judgments, chosen to showcase the king's wisdom, his fairness, his piety, and his commitment to the cosmic order. The stele was erected in public, not so that citizens could look up specific laws, but so they could look upon a monument that embodied the very concept of justice and associate it permanently with the name of their king. It was a self-justification for his conquests and a timeless statement of his fitness to rule, a legal treatise wrapped in a victory monument, designed to secure his legacy for eternity. To fully grasp the purpose of Hammurabi's stele, one must cease to view it as a law code and begin to see it as a monument. Its function was not legislative but declarative. It is, first and foremost, a royal apologia, an elaborate and permanent justification of the king's entire reign, presented in the form of a legal treatise. The timing of its creation is the most compelling evidence for this interpretation. The stele was not erected at the beginning of Hammurabi's reign to guide his new kingdom, but near the end, after his great conquests were complete. It is the work of a king looking back on his achievements, a capstone to a long and transformative career. The monument is his final report, addressed to his subjects, to posterity, and, most importantly, to the gods. The laws inscribed upon it are not a practical guide for the judiciary. They are the evidence presented in this report. The prologue makes the grand claim that Hammurabi was chosen by the gods to establish justice, and the nearly 300 laws that follow are the specific, concrete proofs of this assertion. They are a curated selection of ideal judgments, carefully chosen to showcase the king's wisdom and his commitment to the principles of a just society. By presenting a case where a negligent builder is held accountable for a collapsed house, Hammurabi is not just stating a law, he is demonstrating that he is a king who protects his people from shoddy workmanship. By setting the wages for a herdsman, he is showing that he is a king who ensures fair commerce. Each law is a miniature portrait of the ideal judge, and the collection as a whole is a monumental self-portrait of the ideal king. The physical object itself was central to this function. For the vast majority of his illiterate subjects, the stella's power lay not in its text, but in its symbolic presence. Erected in the temple courtyard, it was a tangible, permanent link between the king, the god, and the abstract concept of justice. It was a constant public performance of righteous rule. A citizen with a grievance could stand before it and feel that he was in the presence of the king's justice, even if he could not read a single character. The monument's true audience, however, may have been more celestial and historical than popular. It was a timeless declaration intended to be read by future kings, a model of perfect kingship for them to emulate. And it was a final accounting to the god Shamash, a detailed report demonstrating that Hammurabi had successfully fulfilled his divine commission to bring order to the land. The stele was not a book of statutes to be carried into court. It was a victory monument, not of a single battle, but of an entire reign, a self-justification carved in eternal stone. The true legacy of Hammurabi is not found in the direct, unbroken application of his specific laws, which became obsolete within generations of his death. Nor is it found in the physical stele, which spent millennia as a forgotten spoil of war. His enduring legacy is the successful establishment of a powerful and revolutionary idea, that justice is the supreme and defining responsibility of the state, and that the worth of a king is measured by the fairness and order he provides for his people. Before Hammurabi, kings were conquerors, builders, and high priests. After him, the ideal of the monarch as the great lawgiver became a central pillar of kingship in the ancient world, a standard against which all subsequent rulers would be judged. This conceptual shift was his most profound achievement. By physically inscribing his laws on a public monument and placing it within the sacred precinct of the temple, he permanently altered the relationship between the ruler, the ruled, and the law. Justice was no longer an opaque process hidden within the discretion of local judges or the unwritten customs of a village. It was now a tangible, royally sanctioned, and, in principle, universally accessible standard. The act of making the law public, even to a largely illiterate populace, was a declaration that the state, not the individual or the clan, was the ultimate arbiter of disputes and the sole legitimate agent of punishment. This principle, the state's monopoly on retributive violence, governed by a written and predictable code, is a foundational concept of all subsequent legal history. Even as his empire crumbled and his laws were superseded, the memory of Hammurabi as the quintessential king of justice endured. The scribal tradition that preserved his code for 1,000 years did so not because it was a practical legal manual, but because it had become a canonical work of political philosophy, a model of perfect kingship. He had so successfully fused his identity with the concept of law that his name became a byword for it. His greatest victory was not on the battlefield, but in the realm of ideology. He had crafted his own legacy, and it was so powerful that it survived the collapse of his dynasty, the destruction of his capital, and the long silence of his monument. When the great stele was finally unearthed in 1901, it was the rediscovery not just of an ancient legal text, but of the very archetype of the lawgiver king. Its influence today is twofold. As a historical document, it provides an unparalleled window into the social structure, economic life, and legal thought of old Babylonian civilization. But as a cultural symbol, it represents something far more universal: humanity's first great, systematic attempt to create a society governed not by the arbitrary whims of the powerful, but by a written, public, and divinely sanctioned standard of justice. The Shepherd King, in his final accounting to the god Shamash, succeeded in creating an eternal monument, not just of diorite, but to the enduring and essential human quest for a just and ordered world.